Picture a world where church bells measured time more accurately than any clock, where the richest merchant and the poorest beggar both emptied their chamber pots into the same cobblestone street, where physicians consulted star charts before examining patients, believing the cosmos controlled human blood. This was Europe in 1347, and it had no idea what was coming. The cities felt alive in a way modern streets never do. Paris, Florence, Venice, these weren't just places people lived. They were organisms, breathing, sweating, rotting from the inside while their surfaces gleamed with new wealth. Trade routes stretched from London to Constantinople, carrying silk and spices and ideas. Cathedrals climbed toward heaven, their spires sharp enough to pierce clouds. Universities taught medicine and philosophy. Art flourished, money flowed. By every measure that mattered to medieval minds, civilization was reaching its peak. But walk through those cities at street level, and you'd find something else entirely. Open sewers ran alongside bakeries. Rats moved through grain stores like they owned them. Butchers tossed waste into alleys where children played. The smell, imagine the smell. Unwashed bodies, animal dung, rotting food, tanning leather, all of it mixing in the summer heat. People believed bathing opened pores to disease, so they avoided it. They believed bad smells caused sickness, so they carried flowers. They believed God controlled health, so they prayed. They believed in balancing bodily humors with bloodletting. They believed Mercury's position affected their liver. They believed many things. Almost all of them were wrong. What's strange isn't that they were ignorant. Everyone in history is ignorant about something. What's strange is how confident they were. Physicians wore long robes and spoke Latin and charged high fees, and everyone assumed they understood disease. The church explained suffering as divine will, and everyone accepted it. Astrologers published charts linking planetary alignments to epidemics, and everyone consulted them. The entire structure of medieval knowledge rested on foundations that were completely, catastrophically incorrect, and nobody knew. Families crowded together in wooden houses that touched their neighbors, creating labyrinths of connected spaces where air barely moved. Markets packed thousands into squares designed for hundreds. Pilgrimages brought strangers from distant lands into close quarters. Ships arrived daily in port cities, unloading cargo and sailors and whatever else hitched a ride. The medieval world was more connected than we imagine, more mobile, more densely populated in its urban centers. All the conditions were perfect. The stage was set, the actors were in position. They just didn't know they were about to perform a tragedy. In 1347, if you'd told a Parisian doctor that half his patients would be dead within 3 years, he would have laughed. If you'd told a Venetian merchant that ships arriving in his harbor carried something worse than any army, he would have called you mad. If you'd told anyone that the strangest doctors in human history were about to emerge figures wearing bird masks, carrying wooden sticks, with the authority to seal homes and certify death, they wouldn't have believed you. But in the East, whispers were already spreading. Merchants returning from trade routes mentioned entire villages going silent. Sailors spoke of ports where ships sat unattended, their crews dead or fled. Letters arrived in Italian city-states, describing something moving west, something that killed faster than war and showed no mercy. The news traveled slowly, filtered through translation and rumor, dismissed by many as exaggeration. It wasn't exaggeration. By October 1347, ships were pulling into Mediterranean harbors carrying more than silk and spices. They were carrying the future. And the future wore black and came with swelling and fever and death that arrived so quickly some victims didn't have time to confess their sins. The world was about to meet something it couldn't pray away, couldn't bleed out, couldn't explain with stars or humors or divine punishment. And when traditional medicine failed completely, when educated physicians fled in terror, something else would take their place. Something with a beak. The city of Caffa sat on the Black Sea coast, a Genoese trading post where east met west. In 1346, it became something else, a laboratory for biological warfare that nobody intended to create. Mongol forces had laid siege to the city for months, and their own camps were dying, not from battle wounds, from something that turned skin black and killed within days. The Mongol commander made a decision that would change history. He loaded his catapults with corpses and launched them over Caffa's walls. The Genoese defenders watched bodies arc through the sky and crash into their streets. They burned what they could. They threw the rest into the sea. But it was already too late. Whatever killed the Mongols was now inside the city, moving from person to person, finding new hosts faster than anyone could track. When Caffa became unbearable, merchants did what merchants do. They loaded their ships and fled. 12 Genoese vessels left port in late 1347, racing toward home, toward safety, toward the Mediterranean. They never should have been allowed to dock. The first ship arrived in Messina, Sicily, in October. Port workers noticed something wrong immediately. Half the crew was dead, the other half was dying. Black swellings bulged from necks and groins. Skin had darkened in patches, like bruises spreading from the inside out. Fever burned so hot that sailors babbled in languages nobody recognized. And the smell eyewitnesses described it as sweetness mixed with rot, like fruit decomposing in the sun. The authorities told the ships to leave. But the damage was done. Within days, people in Messina started showing the same symptoms. A docker developed a lump under his arm. A merchant's wife found swellings in her neck. A priest who'd given last rites to a dying sailor collapsed while saying mass. The pattern was always the same: swelling, fever, black patches, death. Sometimes it took 3 days. Sometimes it took 3 hours. Physicians examined the victims and found themselves baffled. This didn't match anything in their medical texts. The humours seemed balanced. Bloodletting didn't help. Herbal poultices did nothing. They tried everything they knew, and everything failed. Some doctors theorized bad air from earthquakes had corrupted the atmosphere. Others blamed planetary alignments. Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had formed an unusual conjunction in 1345. The more religious declared it divine punishment for humanity's sins. Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells, and violence followed. Nobody understood they were looking at bacteria carried by fleas on rats. Nobody understood that the real danger wasn't the sick people, but the small black insects jumping from body to body. Nobody understood that by the time you saw symptoms, a dozen others were already infected. The ships continued their journey. Marseille, Genoa, Venice. Each port welcomed them. Each port started dying within weeks. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision. Ship arrives. 6 sailors disembark or die aboard. Rats scurry onto docks. Fleas find new hosts. People notice swellings. Physicians are summoned. Treatments fail. Panic spreads faster than understanding. More flee, carrying the plague to new cities. The cycle accelerates. By spring of 1348, the plague had reached France. By summer, England. By autumn, it was racing through the German states. No city was spared. No class was protected. The plague killed peasants and nobles, children and elderly, the devout and the sinful. It moved through monasteries and palaces, through armies and universities. Mortality rates in some cities reached 60%. In others, it was higher. Physicians who stayed to help started dying themselves. The educated elite realized their knowledge was worthless. Humoral theory, astrological medicine, everything they'd learned in universities, none of it mattered. They were watching civilization collapse and had no tools to stop it. Many made a choice that would haunt historical records forever. They abandoned their posts. They left their patients. They fled. And in that abandonment, a vacuum formed. A space that needed filling. Cities still had corpses to count, deaths to certify, sick to examine, and nobody qualified was willing to do it. That's when someone had an idea. A terrible, desperate, necessary idea. If real doctors wouldn't stay, they'd hire anyone who would. They'd create a new kind of physician, one designed specifically for plague, one who expected to die. They called them plague doctors, and nothing in medical history would ever be quite so disturbing again. The medical faculty at the University of Paris closed its doors in June 1348, not temporarily, not with plans to reopen. The professors simply left the city, and their students scattered behind them. These were men who'd studied for years, who understood Galen and Hippocrates, who could recite Avicenna in Latin. They were supposed to be healers. Instead, they became some of the first to run. Florence told a similar story. The city had employed dozens of physicians before the plague arrived. By autumn 1348, most were gone. Some fled to countryside estates. Others moved to smaller towns, hoping distance meant safety. A few stayed and died within weeks. The ones who survived that first wave often left anyway, convinced that remaining meant certain death. City records show payment disputes, families of dead doctors demanding unpaid fees, estates arguing that fleeing violated professional obligations. The legal aftermath revealed how completely the medical establishment had collapsed. Paris, Florence, Venice, London, every major city experienced the same exodus. The pattern was so consistent it couldn't be coincidence. Medieval medicine had no explanation for plague and no effective treatment. Physicians recognized this faster than anyone else. They'd tried everything in their repertoire: bloodletting to balance humors, compounds of crushed emeralds and ground pearls, prayers and incantations, careful examination of patient urine. Nothing worked. Every patient died, and physicians who treated them often died next. So they made a calculation: stay and die uselessly, or flee and survive. Most chose survival. The departure created problems beyond the obvious. Medieval doctors weren't just healers, they were record keepers, death certifiers, community authorities on health matters. When they left, nobody remained to perform these functions. Families couldn't get official death certificates. Property disputes had no medical testimony. Cities couldn't track the plague's spread without someone counting and documenting cases. The infrastructure of medicine didn't just fail, it vanished. Other professions made different choices. Priests, for instance, largely stayed. They knew they'd likely die. Last rites required close contact with infected bodies, but their theology demanded it. Dying souls needed confession and communion. Hundreds of clergy died performing these duties. Gravediggers stayed too, though many demanded wages so high that cities had to pay or watch corpses pile in streets. Even some government officials remained at their posts, trying to maintain order as chaos spread. But doctors, the educated elite trained specifically for health crises, they were gone. This abandonment carried consequences beyond immediate medical needs. It shattered public trust. If physicians, people who supposedly understood disease, fled in terror, what hope did common people have? The betrayal ran deep. Survivors remembered. Even after the plague subsided, many communities regarded physicians differently. The social contract between healer and patient had been broken, and the fracture never fully healed. Cities faced a practical crisis. Someone needed to enter plague houses, examine the sick, certify deaths, and supervise body removal. Someone needed to enforce quarantines and track the spread. The work was essential, and it required at least minimal medical knowledge, but qualified physicians refused. So cities began improvising. They offered contracts to anyone willing to take them. The wages were substantial, sometimes 10 times normal medical fees. The legal protections were extraordinary: immunity from malpractice claims, authority to enter any home, rights to confiscate property from plague houses. But everyone understood the real compensation. You were probably going to die, so the city paid enough that your family would be comfortable after you were gone. Who accepts such a contract? Who walks toward guaranteed death for any amount of money? The answer reveals something dark about human desperation. Some were failures: medical students who'd never qualified, barbers who performed surgery on the side, apothecaries with more ambition than skill. Some were opportunists who saw financial gain worth the risk. A few were genuinely altruistic, believing they could help even when university physicians couldn't. Many were simply desperate refugees, criminals offered pardons, people with nothing left to lose. These became the first plague doctors, not because they were qualified, not because they were brave, but because they were the only ones willing to put on protective clothing, enter homes where everyone was dying, and pretend they could make a difference. The strangest part? Sometimes they did make a difference. Not through healing, their medical knowledge was often worse than what trained physicians possessed, but through presence, through record keeping, through enforcement of quarantine measures that, accidentally, actually slowed transmission, through the simple act of not abandoning people to die alone in sealed houses. They became something medieval Europe had never seen before: a profession born entirely from crisis, designed specifically for catastrophe, with no expectation of long-term existence. They were temporary by definition, emergency personnel for an emergency that kept getting worse, and they were about to develop an image that would outlive the plague itself by 7 centuries. The contracts were written on parchment and sealed with wax, and they all said approximately the same thing. In exchange for examining plague victims, certifying deaths, and maintaining records, the city would pay a sum large enough to make a family comfortable for years. The unwritten part, the part everyone understood, was that you probably wouldn't live long enough to spend it. So who signed? Charles Delorme was a physician, one of the rare university-trained doctors who didn't flee. He served in Paris and later claimed credit for designing the beaked costume that would define the profession. Whether he actually invented it or simply popularized existing designs remains debated. But his name appears in city records with unusual frequency. He survived multiple plague outbreaks, which made him either extraordinarily lucky or extraordinarily careful. His writings suggest he believed in miasma theory absolutely, convinced that proper protective clothing and aromatic substances could filter poisoned air. He was wrong about the mechanism, but accidentally right about protection. Delorme lived to old age, which made him an anomaly. Most plague doctors weren't like him. Michel de Nostradame, better known as Nostradamus, worked as a plague doctor in southern France during the 1522, decades after the Black Death, but during one of its recurring waves. Before he became famous for cryptic prophecies, he walked through dying towns, treating victims with remedies that contemporary physicians considered radical. He advocated fresh air, clean water, and rosehip pills rich in vitamin C. He opposed bloodletting. Some of his patients survived at higher rates than others, though whether this was skill or chance remains unclear. What's certain is that his plague doctor experience shaped his later worldview. After watching thousands die despite every prayer and treatment, he became convinced that future catastrophes could be foreseen, but not prevented. His career shift from medicine to prophecy makes a certain dark sense. But these are the famous names, the exceptions. Most plague doctors left no records beyond contract signatures and death certificates. We know them only through fragments. Giovanni di Something, hired by Venice in 1348, dead within 3 weeks. Marcus the German, employed by a small Bavarian town, disappeared from records entirely. Whether from death or desertion, nobody documented. An unnamed woman in Toulouse who served for 6 months before dying alongside her final patient, mentioned only in a payment dispute between her family and the city. The backgrounds varied wildly. Some were failed medical students who'd attended university but never qualified for licenses. Some were barbers who performed minor surgery alongside haircuts. Some were apothecaries familiar with herbs and compounds but lacking formal training. A few were convicted criminals offered pardons if they'd serve. Records from Barcelona mention 2 prisoners who accepted plague doctor contracts rather than face execution. One died within days, the other survived and was granted freedom only to die in the next outbreak. Class played a role that's impossible to ignore. Wealthy, established physicians fled. Poor, desperate individuals stayed. Many plague doctors were immigrants or outsiders already marginalized by medieval society. Being Jewish, foreign, or from the lowest social classes made you simultaneously unimportant enough to be expendable and available enough to be hired. Cities needed bodies to fill the role, and they weren't particular about qualifications. Can you read enough to keep records? Can you recognize obvious signs of plague? Will you enter homes where everyone is dying? Congratulations, you're a plague doctor. The motivations were complex. Financial desperation drove many wages. Were extraordinary by medieval standards, enough to lift a family from poverty permanently. Some believed genuinely that they could help, that their remedies or prayers or determination might save lives. A few seemed almost suicidal, accepting the contracts because they'd already lost everything and had nothing left to lose. Others were conscripted against their will, forced into service by city authorities who needed plague doctors and didn't care about consent. And some, this is the part that historical records hint at, but never quite say directly, seemed drawn to it for darker reasons. The power, the authority, the opportunity to operate outside normal social rules. Plague doctors had access to homes, bodies, and possessions in ways that would be unthinkable during normal times. That kind of access attracts certain personalities. What united them wasn't background or motivation. It was the acceptance of probable death. Every plague doctor knew the statistics. Most of their predecessors had died. The average tenure was weeks, sometimes days. Survival was exceptional enough to generate stories. When you put on the costume for the first time, you were essentially dead already. The only question was how long the formality would take. Yet they kept signing contracts. As one plague doctor died, another took their place. Cities never ran out of desperate, brave, or opportunistic individuals willing to try. And once hired, each received the same strange uniform. The costume that would haunt collective memory for centuries. The outfit designed to protect against bad air, but which ended up protecting something else entirely. The outfit that made them look like death itself had learned to walk. Imagine seeing one for the first time. You're standing in a medieval street at dusk, and a figure rounds the corner. It's tall, taller than any person should be, the hat adding height, and the long coat adding presence. It moves slowly, deliberately, the stick tapping cobblestones with each step. And the face. Where a face should be, there's a mask. Leather, usually black or brown, fitted tight to the head. Glass circles for eyes, reflecting lamplight like an insect's compound vision. And extending forward, grotesque and impossible, a beak, long, curved, utterly inhuman. Children ran. Adults crossed themselves. Even priests felt uneasy. The costume wasn't designed to terrify, though that became its primary effect. It was designed, like everything in plague medicine, around a theory that was completely wrong but accidentally protective. Medieval physicians believed disease spread through miasma, corrupted air that smelled foul and carried sickness. This wasn't entirely illogical. Plague was associated with terrible odors, rotting bodies, overflowing sewers, the sweet sick smell of infected swellings. Reasonable people concluded that the smell itself carried death. So they built a filter. The beak was hollow, 6 to 8 inches long depending on the maker. Inside went a mixture of substances believed to purify air. Dried rose petals, lavender, camphor, cloves, myrrh, amber, mint, and dozens of other aromatics depending on region and personal preference. Some plague doctors added more exotic ingredients. Ambergris, which comes from whale intestines, storax resin, crushed juniper berries. A few added substances we'd now consider toxic, small amounts of arsenic or mercury compounds, believed to have medicinal properties through smell alone. Breathing through this apparatus was difficult. The aromatics were strong enough to burn nostrils. The beak restricted airflow. Some plague doctors reported dizziness after hours of wear, possibly from inhaling concentrated volatile compounds in an enclosed space, but it created a barrier between their nose and mouth and the patient's breath. It prevented them from getting too close. The beak made intimate examination physically awkward. And though they didn't understand germ theory, this accidental distancing reduced transmission of droplet-borne diseases. The rest of the costume followed similar logic. A long overcoat, usually waxed canvas or leather, covered them from neck to ankle. Waxing made it theoretically waterproof and prevented bad air from seeping through fabric. The coat had no pockets, nothing that would hold contaminated air. A wide-brimmed hat, often dark, served multiple purposes. It marked plague doctors as official, provided some protection from substances dropped from windows above, and added to the intimidating silhouette. Leather gloves covered hands completely. Some plague doctors wore boots, others wrapped their regular shoes in waxed cloth. The whole outfit had to be easy to put on and remove without touching the exterior surface. A principle modern hazmat suits follow. After each day's work, plague doctors would strip carefully, often using their wooden canes to remove garments at arm's length, then treat everything with vinegar or smoke, or both. The costume would hang in isolation, sometimes for days, supposedly to let bad air dissipate. Variations existed across regions and eras. Italian plague doctors favoured black leather masks with shorter beaks. French designs tended toward canvas coats with longer beaks. German variations sometimes included full-face hoods rather than just masks. Later versions, from the 17th and 18th centuries, when the profession had become more established, featured more elaborate designs, decorative stitching, coloured glass in the eye openings, even beaks shaped like actual bird bills rather than simple cones. But the effect was universal. The costume dehumanized completely. It transformed whoever wore it into something other. Not quite human, not quite animal. Definitely not anything that belonged in the natural world. The glass eyes showed no expression. The beak made speech muffled and strange. The long coat eliminated any sense of normal human proportions. When plague doctors moved through streets, they looked like death had taken physical form and was making house calls. People reacted accordingly. Seeing a plague doctor approach your street meant plague had been officially recognized in your neighborhood. Quarantine would follow. Economic ruin was likely. So the costume became associated not just with disease, but with social catastrophe. Parents warned children that if they misbehaved, the beak would come for them. The image appeared in art as a symbol of divine punishment. Even centuries later, after plague had faded and the profession had disappeared, the costume lingered in cultural memory. Modern horror understands why. The plague doctor mask violates something fundamental in human psychology. We're wired to read faces, to find expression and emotion in features. The mask denies this completely. It presents something that's clearly shaped like a head, but refuses to be human. The beak especially triggers unease. It's too long, too sharp, too reminiscent of carrion birds. Our brains register it as wrong, on a level that bypasses conscious thought. And that wrongness served a function nobody intended. The costume created psychological distance that made an impossible job slightly more bearable. Wearing it, you weren't quite yourself anymore. You were the beak. You could enter horror that would break a normal person because you weren't a normal person while wearing it. The mask didn't just protect your lungs, it protected your sanity by creating a barrier between your identity and the work you had to do. But there was a cost. Once you put it on, once you became the beak, getting back to being human was harder than just removing the costume. The wooden cane was 6 feet long, carved from hardwood, and every plague doctor carried one. It wasn't ceremonial. It was the most important tool they possessed, more useful than any medicine they might prescribe. With it, they could examine patients without touching them, lifting sleeves to check for buboes, moving bedsheets aside to observe symptoms, even taking pulses by pressing the cane against wrists. They used it to point at things, to gesture at family members, to step back, to mark doors and walls with chalk or paint. Sometimes, they used it to keep desperate people at a distance when emotions overtook fear of contagion. And sometimes, they used it as a weapon, though records are careful about admitting this directly. The cane symbolized something deeper than medical practice. It represented authority that medieval society had never quite granted to anyone before. Plague doctors operated outside normal legal structures because normal legal structures couldn't handle a pandemic. The powers cities granted them would be shocking even today. They could enter any building without permission or warning. They could examine anyone, regardless of social class. They could certify deaths, which had enormous legal implications for inheritance and property. They could order homes sealed with inhabitants inside. They could condemn buildings to be burned. In some cities, they could enforce quarantines using physical force if necessary. No warrant was required. No appeal existed. When a plague doctor declared your house infected, you had no recourse. This authority made practical sense. Plague moved too fast for normal bureaucratic processes. Waiting for magistrates to issue warrants would mean additional deaths. Allowing families to refuse examination would mean the disease spread unchecked. Cities needed someone who could act immediately, decisively, and without the legal complications that would normally constrain such actions. So they created a role with extraordinary powers and trusted that plague doctors would use them appropriately. That trust was often misplaced. Records hinted abuses without quite documenting them fully. Complaints about plague doctors who demanded bribes before issuing death certificates. Accusations that certain doctors falsely declared homes infected to loot them afterward. Whispers about families sealed in buildings where some inhabitants showed no symptoms. The problem was that investigating these complaints meant questioning the same authority structure that made plague response possible. Cities needed plague doctors more than they needed perfect justice, so minor abuses were ignored, and major ones were handled quietly. Some plague doctors used their authority compassionately. Records mention doctors who risked punishment to reunite dying parents with children, who falsified reports to save families from quarantine, who spent their own money to buy food for sealed households. These acts of humanity show up in grateful letters, in wills that mentioned specific plague doctors by name, in quiet acknowledgements buried in city archives. But the uniform created problems regardless of individual character. When the beak appeared in your neighborhood, it meant official recognition that plague had arrived. Property values would collapse. Businesses would close. Neighbors would flee. Even if no one in your household was sick, the plague doctor's presence could ruin you economically. So, people began hiding symptoms, refusing to call for medical examination, keeping sick family members secret as long as possible. This created a terrible paradox. The authority meant to contain plague actually accelerated its spread by making people conceal it. The costume meant to mark official medical intervention, instead marked economic and social death. Plague doctors found themselves caught between their duty to identify infection and the knowledge that identifying it could destroy families even if everyone survived. The wooden cane became a symbol of this impossible position. It represented power without wisdom, authority without accountability, necessary intervention that felt like violation. When a plague doctor raised their cane to knock on a door, everyone understood what it meant. Life as you knew it was about to end, one way or another. And the person delivering this news was hidden behind a mask, speaking through a beak, looking like something from nightmare rather than medicine. They were both your only hope and your worst fear, simultaneously. Helper and destroyer, physician and executioner, essential and terrifying. This was the contradiction at the heart of plague medicine. To fight the disease, cities created a profession with powers that could be abused. To protect communities, they deployed figures that communities feared. To maintain social order during catastrophe, they sanctioned a role that operated outside normal order. And every day, these figures walked through streets with their canes and their beaks, entering homes, examining bodies, certifying deaths, sealing doors, maintaining records that would outlive most of the people they examined. They were doing necessary work that nobody else would do. But necessity doesn't always mean righteousness. And power without oversight, even during crisis, creates opportunities that some people cannot resist. What plague doctors actually did with that power, how they spent their days, what choices they made, what toll it took on them. That's where the story gets darker still. Dawn arrived differently in plague cities. No roosters crowed, most had been killed and eaten months ago. No merchants called out opening their shops. Half the shops had no owners left alive. What woke people was the sound of wooden wheels on cobblestone, the death cart making its rounds. And shortly after, another sound, the hollow tap of a wooden cane striking stone in rhythmic pattern. The beak was coming. Plague doctors began their days before first light. The costume took time to don properly, and doing it wrong could mean death. First came the undergarments, often soaked in vinegar overnight. Then the waxed overcoat, heavy and stiff, fastened carefully to prevent gaps, gloves pulled tight, hat secured. And finally, the mask, pressed against the face until it felt like wearing someone else's skin. The aromatics in the beak had to be fresh. Yesterday's lavender and cloves had absorbed too much contaminated air, or so the theory went. Some plague doctors replaced the herbs daily. Others couldn't afford to, and simply added more on top of the old, creating a concentrated mixture that burned with every breath. The tools came next. Wooden cane, essential. Lancets for bloodletting. Though many plague doctors had stopped bothering, the patients died anyway. Small bottles of remedies that didn't work, but had to be carried because families expected them. A piece of chalk for marking doors. Vinegar for washing hands, though the gloves made this somewhat pointless. A ledger book for recording deaths. The ledger was the most important item. Cities paid for documentation as much as for treatment. The first house was always the worst. Not because the symptoms were more severe, they were all severe, but because the night had sealed in the smells. Opening the door released a wave of odor that made even aromatic stuffed beaks inadequate. Sweat and excrement, and the particular sweetness of flesh beginning to rot while still alive. Plague doctors learned to breathe shallowly, to not think about what they were inhaling. Inside, The tableau was always similar: bodies on pallets, sometimes alive, sometimes not, sometimes impossible to tell without checking. The living begged, the dying moaned. The dead simply lay there, and often nobody had moved them, because touching corpses meant infection. Families huddled in corners, terrified that the beak had come for them next. Examination was mechanical. Approach but don't touch. Use the cane to lift blankets, to turn heads, to expose armpits and groins where buboes swelled. The lymph nodes would be grotesquely enlarged, sometimes the size of eggs, black or purple or greenish depending on stage of infection. Press near them with the cane. If the patient screamed, they were still conscious. If they didn't react, death was close. Check the skin. Black patches meant gangrene spreading. Count them, note their locations in the ledger. Check the eyes. Yellow meant liver failure. Check breathing patterns. Labored and wet meant lungs filling with fluid. All of this from a distance, through glass eyepieces that fogged with breath, using a wooden stick as your only point of contact. Make the assessment. This one will die today. That one might last until tomorrow. The child in the corner shows no symptoms yet, but has been exposed. Quarantine the whole house. The mother is already dead, though she's still breathing. The blackness has reached her torso. Nothing to be done. Mark the door with chalk. A cross, usually, sometimes other symbols depending on the city. Red paint if you had it. The mark meant official plague recognition. It meant the house was sealed. It meant nobody enters, nobody leaves, not until everyone inside was either recovered or dead. And recovery was rare enough that the mark essentially meant the latter. Move to the next house. Then the next. The tapping of the cane announced your approach, and you could hear shutters closing, people trying to hide inside, hoping you'd pass them by. But the beak knew which houses to visit. Someone had reported symptoms, or a neighbor had complained about smells, or bodies had been seen through windows. The beak always knew. By the third house, the smell stopped registering. The mind has protective mechanisms, and one of them is sensory adaptation. What seemed unbearable at the first door became simply background by the third. By the fifth house, you stopped really seeing the people. They became symptoms, collections of buboes and black patches and death timelines. This one, 6 hours. That one, already gone. Next. By the 10th house, something else happened. Something darker. You stopped caring whether your assessments were accurate, whether the chalk mark condemned people who might have survived, whether the family you just sealed inside had enough food and water. It stopped mattering because it was all going to end the same way regardless. They would die. You would move to the next house. The cart would come for their bodies. The cycle would continue. This was when plague doctors became truly dangerous. Not because they spread disease, though they probably did, but because they stopped being human. The costume helped with this transformation. You couldn't see your own face. You couldn't recognize your own voice, muffled through the beak. You became the role completely, and the role was death's accountant. Some plague doctors fought this numbness. They tried to maintain compassion, to see individuals rather than symptoms, to remember names instead of just recording them. These doctors tended not to last long. Either they died from getting too close, or they broke psychologically and abandoned their posts. The ones who survived learned to stop caring, learned to make the rounds mechanically, marking doors and recording deaths, and moving forward without thought. Morning rounds typically lasted 4 to 6 hours. In a bad week, that might mean visiting 40 or 50 houses. In a terrible week, more. Each visit perhaps 10 minutes, long enough to assess, to mark, to record, to move on. Efficiency was survival. Hesitation was death, either literal or psychological. By midday, the ledger would have names and addresses, symptoms, and estimated death times. The marks on doors throughout the district would map the plague's spread, and the plague doctor would move to the next phase of their work, attempting treatments that almost never worked and frequently made things worse. The theory was beautiful in its simplicity. Human bodies contained 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and illness meant these were out of balance. Plague patients clearly had an excess of corrupted blood, evidenced by the swelling and darkness. So the solution was obvious: remove the excess, let out the bad blood, restore balance, save the patient. It almost never worked. It usually hastened death. But plague doctors did it anyway because medieval medicine had no other framework for understanding disease. Bloodletting required getting close to the patient, which meant the plague doctor's costume was the only barrier between themselves and infection. The lancet was small, sharp, designed to open veins quickly. Common sites were the arm, the leg, sometimes the neck, if the doctor was experienced. The theory specified letting out specific amounts based on the patient's age, constitution, and phase of the moon. Yes, the moon mattered. Everything mattered in medieval medicine, except actual effectiveness. The patient was already weak from plague, already dying from massive infection. Removing blood, sometimes a pint or more, simply accelerated the process. They'd die faster, more peacefully perhaps, but definitely dead. Families watching this happen would sometimes see the patient relax after bloodletting and assume it was working. They were actually watching someone slip into terminal shock. Leeches were considered a gentler alternative. Medical leeches were bred specifically for the purpose, fat black things that attached and fed until engorged. Plague doctors would apply them near buboes, believing they'd draw out poison along with blood. The leeches would feed, drop off, and the patient would be slightly more anemic and no better off. Sometimes the leech bites would become infected themselves, adding new problems to existing ones. But bloodletting was almost humane compared to what came next. Lancing buboes was considered advanced treatment, reserved for patients whose swelling was severe. The theory held that buboes contained concentrated poison that needed to be released. This was partly true. The swelling was pus and dead tissue, but medieval methods of releasing it were catastrophically brutal. The plague doctor would heat a lancet in flame, supposedly to purify it, but actually just making it hurt worse. Then they'd cut into the bubo a swollen, painful lymph node, causing agony that made patients scream loud enough to be heard streets away. Pus and blood would drain. The wound would be left open or packed with various substances, meant to continue drawing poison out. In reality, this accomplished several things, none of them good. It created open wounds in patients with compromised immune systems. It spread infection from one site to others. It caused additional trauma to bodies already failing. And the substances used to pack wounds were their own kind of horror. Medical texts from the period list ingredients for poultices that read like recipes for curses. Crushed emeralds, if you could afford them, mixed with rose water. Ground unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk shavings sold at extraordinary prices. Dried frog parts, especially the liver. Mercury compounds that were themselves poisonous. Arsenic paste, which medieval doctors thought purified corruption, but which actually added heavy metal poisoning to the patient's problems. Human excrement, particularly from healthy children, mixed with various herbs. This last one wasn't rare. It appears repeatedly in medical manuscripts, always described matter-of-factly, as if applying feces to open wounds was perfectly reasonable. Some treatments were more elaborate. Live chickens or pigeons would be cut open and applied to buboes, the theory being that living flesh would draw poison from dying flesh. The birds would die, obviously, absorbing the corruption. New birds would be applied. This continued until either the patient died or the doctor ran out of birds, usually the former. Other treatments involved creating blisters on healthy skin to draw poison away from infected sites. Spanish fly, a toxic beetle, was crushed and applied to create chemical burns. These burns were then kept open with various irritating substances. The logic was that if you could get poison to drain through the blisters instead of the buboes, you might save the patient. What actually happened was additional suffering added to existing agony. Aromatic fumigation was considered essential. Plague doctors would burn combinations of fragrant woods, herbs, and substances like sulfur in sick rooms. The smoke was meant to purify air and drive out corruption. Instead, it made breathing difficult for patients whose lungs were already compromised. Some patients probably died from smoke inhalation rather than plague, though no one was counting carefully enough to notice. Dietary treatments were elaborate and specific. Wine mixed with gold flakes, milk from virtuous women, broths made from particular combinations of herbs gathered under specific astrological conditions. None of it mattered. The patients were dying from bacterial infection, and no amount of ceremonial soup was going to produce antibiotics. Some plague doctors developed signature treatments they swore by. Secret recipes passed between practitioners. Special timing based on personal observations. None of it underwent anything resembling testing or verification. If a patient survived after receiving a treatment, the doctor claimed success. If they died, the plague was simply too advanced. The framework made it impossible to be wrong. What's tragic is that plague doctors occasionally stumbled onto things that actually helped, but for the wrong reasons, and without understanding why. Keeping patients isolated slowed transmission. Ensuring good ventilation reduced airborne particle concentration. Washing hands in vinegar, while not understanding antisepsis, still reduced bacterial load. These accidental successes were buried among dozens of harmful practices, impossible to distinguish without modern knowledge. The afternoon brought more of the same. Different houses, same symptoms, same useless treatments. Plague doctors would move from patient to patient, performing rituals that medicine demanded but which accomplished nothing except prolonging suffering. They weren't monsters most genuinely believed they were helping. But good intentions don't cure bacterial infections, and medieval medicine had nothing that could. By evening, the day's treatment rounds were complete. Patients were left with their poultices and bloodletting wounds and burned blisters, slightly worse off than before the beak arrived. And the plague doctor moved to their final duty, the paperwork. The ledger had to be precise. City officials demanded exact numbers, and plague doctors who kept poor records lost their contracts. Name of deceased, address, date, and approximate time of death. Symptoms observed. Number of others in household showing symptoms. Estimated number who would die within the week. The accounting of catastrophe, written in careful script with ink that sometimes ran because the gloves made writing difficult. This wasn't just bureaucratic pedantry. The data determined city policy, which neighborhoods to quarantine, which markets to close, whether to implement travel restrictions, when to dig new mass graves. The numbers in plague doctor ledgers shaped the lives of thousands who would never see the pages themselves. A good plague doctor could certify 30 deaths in an afternoon. An efficient one might manage 50. The process became mechanical. Enter house. Confirm death. Checking for breath, checking for pulse, checking that the body had cooled. Record name, if family knew it. Record address, always. Note any property of value, because technically this now belonged to the city to offset plague expenses. Mark the door to indicate removal was needed. Exit, move to next house, repeat. The death carts came behind the plague doctor's route, like a shadow following a body. 2 or 3 men, usually criminals forced into service, pulling wagons with wooden sides. They'd enter marked houses, remove bodies without ceremony, stack them in the cart. Families sometimes tried to hold funerals. The cartmen rarely allowed it. Bodies were contamination, and contamination needed to be removed quickly. Mass graves on city outskirts received the dead. Huge pits, sometimes 50 feet long, filled layer by layer. Bodies stacked, limes spread over them to speed decomposition and reduce smell. Then more bodies. When a pit was full, it would be covered and a new one dug. Venice, surrounded by water, resorted to plague islands. Entire islands converted to graveyards. Boats dumping bodies on shores where they'd be buried in shifts. Some plague doctors supervised this process. Others couldn't stomach it and stayed away. The supervision was meant to prevent theft. Bodies often had jewelry, good clothing, anything valuable that cartmen might pocket. It also ensured proper disposal. Bodies thrown in rivers instead of graves could spread plague downstream. Bodies buried too shallowly attracted animals. Someone had to watch, to record, to maintain the grim machinery of mass death. The paperwork extended beyond just death certification. Plague doctors reported on quarantine compliance, which families had broken seals and fled, which neighborhoods showed new outbreak signs, which doctors or priests had died and needed replacement. The administrative burden was substantial enough that some plague doctors employed assistants, usually people even more desperate than themselves, willing to work near plague for partial wages. These assistants died frequently. They appear in records as footnotes. My assistant perished on the 15th. Appears in one Venice plague doctor's log, noted between entries about patient deaths, given no more weight than any other mortality. A replacement would be found, usually within days. The work continued. Evening brought a different task, dealing with the living who wanted to become dead. Families hiding sick members to avoid quarantine. People demanding their loved ones be buried properly, not thrown in pits. Merchants bribing plague doctors to falsify records so their shops wouldn't be marked infected. The ethical complications were constant and impossible to navigate cleanly. Some plague doctors accepted bribes. The pay was good, but why not make it better? A false death certificate meant inheritance disputes could be settled favorably. A falsified infection report could condemn a business rival's shop to closure. The power to declare plague was also power to destroy economically, and that power had value to the right people. Others maintained rigid honesty, refusing bribes, following regulations exactly. These doctors were simultaneously respected and hated. Respected for integrity, hated for inflexibility. When your family's survival depends on a plague, doctors' discretion, and they refuse to show any, respect doesn't pay for food. The line between compensation and corruption was often unclear. Plague doctors were legally entitled to property from houses where everyone died. This made sense. Someone had to pay for their dangerous work, and the dead didn't need possessions. But deciding what constituted fair compensation versus looting required judgment calls that few doctors were qualified to make ethically. By nightfall, a plague doctor might have visited 50 houses, certified dozens of deaths, supervised body removal from a dozen locations, filled pages in their ledger, made countless judgment calls about quarantine and property, and who lived sealed in their homes and who died. The day's work was complete. The costume could be removed, treated with vinegar and smoke, hung to air. The plague doctor could eat, if they still had appetite, sleep, if they could manage it. And tomorrow, the cycle would repeat. Different houses, same horrors, different names in the ledger, same inevitability. The beak would wake with dawn, don its costume, pick up its cane, and walk again through streets where death had become routine, and documenting it was just another job. The houses were marked, sometimes with paint, sometimes with carved symbols, sometimes just by the way neighbors avoided walking past them. Everyone knew where plague doctors lived, and everyone stayed away. Not because the law required it, though some cities did mandate distance, but because fear created its own quarantine more effective than any regulation. Most plague doctors couldn't go home. Cities forbade it, understanding that a man who spent his days touching plague victims shouldn't sleep beside his wife and children. So they were housed in designated buildings, often confiscated from families who died. Empty homes repurposed for the living dead, because that's what plague doctors were, functionally. Still breathing, still working, but socially deceased. Cut off from everything that made life livable. The accommodations varied wildly, based on city wealth, and how much they valued their plague doctors. Venice provided relatively comfortable quarters, multiple rooms, furnished adequately, with servants who'd bring food and leave it outside doors. Florence was less generous. Many Florentine plague doctors lived in single rooms barely larger than cells, with straw mattresses and little else. The message was clear. You're tools, not people, and tools don't need comfort. But luxury or austerity, all plague doctor housing shared certain features. Distance from populated areas. A place to store and treat the contaminated costume. Space for the elaborate cleaning rituals that consumed hours each day. And always, isolation. The rituals were complex. After removing the costume using the wooden cane to avoid touching exterior surfaces, every piece would be treated. Vinegar washing for leather parts. Smoke treatment for everything the coat would hang in a sealed room where sulfur and herbs burned for hours. The beak required special attention. The aromatics inside had absorbed contaminated air and needed complete replacement. Some plague doctors burned the old herbs. Others, unable to afford daily replacement, tried to purify them through exposure to smoke or sunlight, following theories that had no basis but felt like they should work. Personal washing was equally elaborate. Strip completely. Wash with vinegar-soaked cloths every inch of exposed skin. Some plague doctors shaved their entire bodies regularly, believing hair trapped bad air. Rinse with water if available, though water was often scarce. Put on clean clothes, kept separate from everything that touched the costume. The whole process could take an hour or more. And then what? Sit alone in a marked house, eating food left outside your door by people who wouldn't make eye contact. No conversation, no human touch, no normal interaction of any kind. Just silence and the memory of what you'd seen that day. Letters survive from some plague doctors to families they couldn't see. The tone is distinctive, a strange mixture of mundane detail and existential despair. A Venetian plague doctor wrote to his wife about needing new gloves, then segued into questioning whether he still existed as himself or had become something else entirely. A French doctor's letters to his children included practical advice about money and property, never mentioning that he expected to be dead before they could use it. The subtext was always the same. I'm already gone. I'm writing from the other side of a barrier I can't cross back over. Some plague doctors prepared wills before taking contracts. This wasn't unusual. Medieval people made wills regularly, but plague doctor wills had a particular quality. They were written with absolute certainty about death, usually including specific instructions about costume disposal and requests that their bodies be burned rather than buried. They knew. They'd seen what happened to plague victims, and they assumed the same would happen to them. The isolation created strange dynamics among plague doctors themselves. In cities with multiple doctors, they often formed tight communities. They'd meet in designated locations, abandoned buildings, sections of graveyards, places nobody else would go to share information, and simply be around others who understood. These gatherings appear in city records as concerns about plague doctors congregating, officials worried about what they might be plotting. The reality was probably simpler and sadder. They were just lonely. Records hint at deeper bonds. Wills that left possessions to fellow plague doctors rather than family. Letters mentioning, "my brother's in the beak," with obvious affection. Accounts of plague doctors taking apprentices, passing on knowledge and technique. This was the only community available to them. Others who'd crossed the same line, who lived in the same liminal space between the living and the dead. The stigma didn't end with the plague. Survivors found themselves permanently marked. Former plague doctors who tried to resume normal lives discovered that people remembered. Potential employers wouldn't hire them. Neighbors avoided them. Some cities required them to continue wearing identifying markers, a cloth badge, a particular color clothing so people could maintain distance. The contamination was considered permanent, not just physical but spiritual. You'd touch too much death. You'd cross too far into darkness. You couldn't come all the way back. A few plague doctors simply disappeared after the plague ended. They walked away from their lives and were never heard from again. Some probably died and weren't documented. Others might have started over in distant cities where nobody knew what they'd been. A handful, perhaps, chose to remain in the liminal space they'd inhabited for so long, unable to return to normalcy that no longer fit. One account from Barcelona mentions a former plague doctor who lived for years in an abandoned watchtower outside the city, occasionally appearing at markets to trade, always wearing his mask, though the plague had ended decades earlier. People left food for him. Nobody asked questions. He'd become permanent ghost, haunting himself. The profound loneliness of plague doctor life is difficult to convey adequately. Modern isolation has comparisons, solitary confinement, deep space missions, but medieval isolation was different. No phones, no letters that would be answered, no expectation of eventual reunion. Just immediate, total, permanent separation from everything that made you human, while still being required to function as if you were. And every night, alone in marked houses that felt like tombs for people not yet dead, plague doctors faced the question, who am I now? What remains of the person I was? If I survive this, what survives with me? Most never found answers. They just lived with the questions until the questions became identity itself. The nightmares followed patterns. Plague doctors across different cities, different eras, different backgrounds reported remarkably similar dreams. The mask wouldn't come off. Underneath the beak, their face had rotted. They were examining patients who were themselves. They were sealing houses with their own families inside. The dreams were so consistent that historians have wondered if they point to something fundamental about trauma's effect on the human mind. One Venetian plague doctor kept a journal that survived in church archives. The entries start professionally patient counts, symptom notes, treatment records. Then around week 3, the handwriting changes. Becomes irregular. The content shifts. He describes dreaming that he's removing his mask after a day's work and finding nothing underneath. No face, no head. Just emptiness inside the costume, somehow still walking, still working. He writes that the dream felt right, that he'd been looking for himself behind the mask and finding absence seemed accurate rather than frightening. 3 months later, his final entry, the dream came again. I welcomed it. At least in sleep I can still feel something. Medieval medicine had no concept of psychological trauma. They recognized melancholy, a humoral imbalance that made people sad and withdrawn. They acknowledged madness when people behaved irrationally or saw things that weren't there. But the idea that experiencing horrible things could permanently alter your mind? That witnessing death constantly could break something in you that never healed? This wasn't part of their framework. So plague doctors suffering what we'd now diagnose as PTSD had no language for what was happening to them. They couldn't say, I have intrusive memories, or I'm experiencing emotional numbing, or I'm hypervigilant and can't relax. They could only describe symptoms in moral or spiritual terms. I've been corrupted. I've seen too much evil. God has abandoned me. My soul is damaged. The symptoms were consistent across accounts we have. Difficulty sleeping, but also difficulty waking, a desire to remain unconscious where the real world couldn't intrude. Emotional flatness, inability to feel joy or sadness, or anything except a dull awareness of existing. Hypervigilance, jumping at sounds, constantly scanning for threats. Intrusive thoughts and memories that appeared without warning. Avoidance of anything that reminded them of their work, which was difficult when your work was everywhere. Some plague doctors developed what we'd recognize as dissociation. They'd describe watching themselves work as if from outside their bodies, observing the beak moving through rooms and marking doors, but not feeling connected to the actions. This served a protective function. If you're not really present, the horror can't really touch you. But it also meant losing sense of yourself, becoming a character you played rather than a person you were. Others went the opposite direction, becoming hyper-aware of everything. One account describes a plague doctor who couldn't stop counting. He'd count steps between houses, count bodies in carts, count syllables in prayers, count breaths until falling asleep. The counting was compulsive, an attempt to impose order on chaos through numbers. When his contract ended and he tried to stop working, the counting continued. He counted everything for the rest of his life, which wasn't long. He died by suicide within a year. Suicide among plague doctors was common enough that cities began including provisions in contracts about what happened to payments if doctors killed themselves. The records are matter of fact about it. Should the doctor take his own life, payment transfers too? As if this was expected and required administrative planning. Some plague doctors hanged themselves. Others walked into plague houses without costumes, effectively choosing infection. A few simply disappeared into rivers or wilderness. Their bodies never recovered. The psychological mechanisms for coping were limited and mostly ineffective. Alcohol appears constantly in plague doctor accounts. Wine in particular, it was considered medicinal, so drinking heavily was almost professional duty. Many plague doctors were functionally alcoholics, though medieval society didn't have that concept either. They were just men who needed wine to sleep and more wine to wake, and wine throughout the day to maintain the numbness necessary for functioning. Dark humor emerges in the records too. Plague doctors developed jokes about their work, gallows humor that helped process horror by making it absurd. These jokes don't survive well. They were verbal, shared among doctors, lost when the doctors died. But references appear in disapproving accounts from clergy and officials. Plague doctors laughing at funerals, making light of death tolls. The humor was protective mechanism and coping strategy, but outsiders saw it as evidence that plague doctors had become morally corrupted. Religious fervor was another common response. Some plague doctors became intensely devoted, attending Mass multiple times daily when they could, praying constantly, seeking meaning in faith. They'd interpret survival as divine favor and deaths as divine will. This framework allowed them to continue working. They were God's instruments, doing holy work, saving souls, even when they couldn't save bodies. The psychological comfort of believing your trauma served higher purpose made the trauma bearable. But others went the opposite direction. They lost faith completely, deciding that no benevolent God would allow what they witnessed daily. These plague doctors became cynical, nihilistic, sometimes cruel. If nothing mattered, if death was random and meaningless, why pretend otherwise? Why maintain compassion when compassion changed nothing? Some of the worst abuse cases involve plague doctors who'd clearly stopped believing in anything except power and survival. The most disturbing psychological pattern was what historians have called plague doctor syndrome. Doctors who seemed unable to stop, even when they could. The plague would end, contracts would expire, and some doctors would seek new positions in other cities. They'd travel to wherever plague was still active, volunteering their services, wearing the costume even when unnecessary. This wasn't altruism, it was addiction. The role provided identity, it provided purpose. It provided an explanation for why you felt dead inside. You worked with death, so of course you felt this way. Returning to normal life meant confronting that you'd been permanently changed, that the person you were before was gone. Continuing as a plague doctor meant you didn't have to face that loss. One case study appears in multiple historical sources. A doctor who worked plague outbreaks across Europe for over 30 years. Barcelona, Venice, Paris, London, back to Italy, up through German states, into Poland. He was wealthy from accumulated contracts, could have retired anywhere, but kept signing new agreements. His letters suggest he didn't know how to be anything else. The costume had become his identity more thoroughly than his actual face. Modern healthcare workers in pandemic situations report similar patterns. The inability to decompress, the sense that normal life is fake and only crisis work is real. The difficulty connecting with people who haven't experienced the same trauma. The feeling of being permanently separated from regular society. Plague doctors were experiencing these exact phenomena 600 years ago, just without vocabulary to articulate it. What broke people varied individually. For some, it was a specific death, a child, usually, or someone who reminded them of family. For others, it was accumulation, a final straw after months of straws. Some seemed fine until the work ended, then collapsed completely when they no longer had purpose holding them together. And some never broke visibly at all, just became quieter and more distant until they were functionally absent, even when physically present. The tragedy is that medieval society provided no support, no concept of counseling or therapy, no understanding that minds could be wounded like bodies. Plague doctors were expected to simply endure, and when they couldn't, they were blamed for weakness or moral failure. The psychological damage was invisible, so it was treated as if it didn't exist. Yet it existed. It destroyed people as thoroughly as plague destroyed bodies. And the beaked mask that protected them from infection couldn't protect them from the slow internal collapse that came from witnessing too much death while pretending to be something other than human. Not all the stories are dark. The records hold moments that complicate the narrative, that show humanity persisting despite everything designed to destroy it. These moments are harder to find. Compassion doesn't generate complaints or legal disputes, but they exist in letters, wills, grateful testimony, and the rare instances when someone bothered to document kindness. A plague doctor in Marseille named Jacques is mentioned in a family's letter to city officials. Their 8-year-old daughter was dying, sealed in a room to prevent spreading infection to her younger siblings. She was terrified, crying for her mother, who couldn't enter. Jacques arrived to examine her, and according to the letter, he stayed for 6 hours. He sat outside the sealed room and sang to her. Children's songs, prayers, anything to help her feel less alone. He risked nothing by doing this. Singing through a door was safe enough, but he didn't have to. His contract required examination and documentation, not comfort. Yet he gave comfort anyway. The girl died. Jacques noted it in his records professionally. The family's letter thanking him exists in archives because they sent copies to multiple officials, wanting his compassion documented. The letter says he made her death gentler, that she stopped crying, that she asked him to tell her mother she wasn't scared anymore, Small mercy and overwhelming horror, but mercy nonetheless. Another account from Florence describes a plague doctor who used his own money to buy food for quarantined families. The city provided nothing if you were sealed in your house. You either had food stored or you starved. This doctor, name lost to time, would note which houses had children and arrange for bread and watered wine to be left at their doors. He did this quietly, never claiming credit, discovered only after his death when going through his financial records. He'd spent nearly half his plague wages feeding others. Why? The records don't say. Maybe he had children himself and couldn't bear watching others' children starve. Maybe he felt guilty about sealing houses and wanted to mitigate the cruelty. Maybe simple human decency survived in him when it died in others. His motivation matters less than his actions. He chose kindness when nothing required it. Adoption records reveal plague doctors who took in orphan children. This was extraordinary. Nobody wanted plague orphans. They were considered contaminated, cursed, dangerous. Most died in makeshift orphanages or on streets. But some plague doctors, already contaminated themselves, already isolated, brought orphan children into their quarantine houses. They fed them, taught them, in some cases eventually arranged proper adoptions after the plague ended and the children were deemed safe. One case from Venice involved a plague doctor named Paolo, who adopted 4 children from different families he'd treated. All the biological parents dead, no relatives willing to claim them. Paolo kept them in his quarters, taught them to read, left them substantial inheritance in his will. He died of plague eventually. The children survived, and decades later, one of them became a physician himself, mentioning in his own records that he'd been raised by a plague doctor who showed him that healing meant more than just medicine. Some acts of compassion were professional violations that plague doctors committed deliberately, falsifying records to save people from quarantine, declaring houses clean when they weren't because the family had lost enough already, breaking seals to let families reunite, risking their positions and possibly lives to allow dying parents to hold their children one last time. These violations appear occasionally in investigations. A plague doctor in Paris was questioned about suspiciously low death rates in certain neighborhoods. Investigation revealed he'd been marking houses as cleared prematurely, giving families more time before official quarantine. He was reprimanded but not fired because the city still needed him. His defense was simple. They were dying anyway. Let them die together rather than separately. Other doctors organized secret burials. Official policy demanded mass graves, but families wanted individual burials, proper rites, respect for their dead. Some plague doctors would note bodies as collected when they hadn't been, giving families a few hours to bury their loved ones properly before the cart arrived. This was technically theft. Dead bodies were city property, but it was theft motivated by mercy. The compassion sometimes extended to moments of simple human connection. Records mention plague doctors who prayed with patients, not because protocol required it, but because patients asked, and the doctors agreed. Doctors who held dying people's hands through their gloves, knowing it did nothing medically, but understanding it meant everything emotionally. Doctors who learned names and used them instead of just recording them, who asked about families and histories, who treated patients as people rather than symptoms. One journal entry from an unnamed plague doctor describes sitting with an elderly man as he died. The man had outlived his entire family, was alone, asked only that someone be present for his death so he didn't die isolated. The plague doctor stayed. The entry notes, "I accomplished nothing medical, but he died less afraid. Perhaps that is also medicine." What motivated these acts? Some plague doctors were genuinely compassionate people who maintained their humanity despite everything. Others found that small kindnesses helped them feel less monstrous, preserved something essential in themselves. Some seemed to be seeking redemption. Records hint at plague doctors with criminal pasts who used compassion as a form of penance. The motivations were probably mixed and complicated. Humans contain multitudes. The same person who accepted bribes might also comfort dying children. The same doctor who falsified records for money might also falsify them for mercy. Moral consistency is easy in normal circumstances. Crisis reveals that people are capable of both profound kindness and casual cruelty. sometimes in the same afternoon. These moments of compassion matter because they complicate the narrative. Plague doctors weren't simply monsters or heroes. They were people operating in impossible situations, making choices that revealed character. Some chose cruelty, some chose kindness. Most chose both, depending on circumstances and emotional reserves, and what they thought they could live with. The tragedy isn't that darkness existed. Of course it did, given the circumstances. The tragedy is that compassion existed too, but was much harder to sustain. Being kind required extra effort when basic functioning took everything you had. It required emotional availability when numbness was the only way to survive. It required seeing patients as human when seeing them as symptoms made the work bearable. That anyone managed it is remarkable. That it happened often enough to leave documentary evidence is almost miraculous. In the worst circumstances imaginable, some people still chose to be gentle. Still chose mercy over efficiency, humanity over protocol, connection over self-protection. And these choices mattered. A child died less afraid. A family got to bury their grandmother properly. An orphan found a new home. Small victories in overwhelming defeat, but real victories nonetheless. Proof that even in darkness, even wearing the mask of death itself, some people remembered what it meant to be human and chose to act accordingly. Power without oversight produces predictable results. Plague doctors had authority to enter homes, examine bodies, certify deaths, and seize property. They operated during chaos when normal accountability had collapsed. Some used this authority to help, others saw opportunity. The thefts started small. A ring from a dead woman's finger, coins from a merchant's purse, clothing that was too fine to waste on a corpse destined for a mass grave. Technically, plague doctors were entitled to compensation from plague houses. The law acknowledged that serving the dying deserved payment beyond their contracts. But the line between legitimate compensation and looting was thin, and many plague doctors crossed it without hesitation. Avignon, 1348. City officials received complaints about a plague doctor named Guillaume. 14 families accused him of theft. When authorities searched his quarters, they found gold jewelry, silver candlesticks, fine fabrics, religious icons, items clearly taken from multiple households. The evidence was overwhelming. Guillaume's defense was remarkably simple. They won't need it. They're dead. I'm alive. I deserve payment for the risk I take. The officials debated prosecution. The problem was practical rather than moral. Guillaume was the only plague doctor still working in that district. Every other doctor had died or fled. If they arrested him, who would certify deaths? Who would track the plague spread? Who would enforce quarantine? The choice came down to justice or functionality. They chose functionality. Guillaume was released with a warning that everyone knew was meaningless. This pattern repeated across Europe. Plague doctors caught stealing, documented thoroughly, then released because they were too necessary to punish. The message was clear. During crisis, competence mattered more than character. If you were willing to do the work, considerable misconduct would be tolerated. The corruption evolved beyond simple theft. Some plague doctors began extorting families. Pay me, or I'll declare your house infected and have it sealed. Pay me, or the death certificate will list plague as cause and you'll lose property rights. Pay me, or I'll report that you violated quarantine and have you arrested. The threats were backed by absolute authority. There was no appeal process, no oversight mechanism, no way to prove a plague doctor was lying. Records from Florence document a case where a wealthy merchant's widow paid a plague doctor substantial sums to falsify her husband's death certificate. If plague was listed as cause, her property would be seized and burned. The plague doctor certified death by sudden fever, technically accurate but deliberately misleading. The widow kept her estate. The plague doctor kept the bribe. And the actual plague victim's body was never properly disposed of, potentially spreading infection. False declarations of infection were particularly cruel. A plague doctor could condemn someone's home, sealing them inside, based solely on his word. If he wanted to ruin a business competitor, eliminate a romantic rival, or simply claim property he desired, he had the power to do so. Proving fraud was nearly impossible. Plague symptoms were variable enough that almost anything could be justified as suspicious. Cities attempted regulation. Contracts included specific prohibitions against theft and corruption. Some cities created oversight committees to investigate complaints. Venice established a formal review process where plague doctor decisions could be challenged, but enforcement was sporadic at best. Investigating a plague doctor meant getting close to someone who spent their days in plague houses. Few officials were willing. And even when investigations found misconduct, the same problem emerged. Punishing the plague doctor meant losing their services. The low social status of many plague doctors contributed to corruption. They were outsiders, criminals offered pardons, failures from other professions. Many had been poor all their lives. Suddenly, they had authority and access to wealth. The temptation was immense, and the knowledge they'd probably die soon removed long-term consequences. Why not take everything you can while you're alive? You won't be alive much longer anyway. This live for today mentality appears explicitly in some plague doctor writings. A journal fragment from a German doctor. I take what I want because tomorrow I'll be in a pit with the rest of them. Let God judge whether I deserve it. I'll know soon enough. The corruption wasn't universal. Many plague doctors remained honest despite opportunity and lack of oversight. But enough engaged in exploitation that it became part of the profession's reputation, not healers, but predators, using crisis for personal gain. And the worst part was that cities had to tolerate it because the alternative was worse. Theft, bribery, extortion, these were bad. But some plague doctors did something darker still. They experimented. The manuscript was discovered in 1982, tucked behind a false panel in a monastery basement outside Prague. 67 pages, written in careful Latin, dated to 1349. The content was disturbing enough that the monastery had apparently hidden it deliberately, though whether to preserve or suppress it remains unclear. The manuscript was a plague doctor's experimental log. Each entry followed the same format. Patient description, initial symptoms, treatment applied, time until death, cause of death if determinable. The treatments varied wildly, standard remedies, unusual combinations, and increasingly bizarre compounds. The doctor was systematically testing what happened when you tried different approaches. He was conducting experiments, and his subjects were people who had no idea they were being used as test cases. Entry 43 describes applying a paste made from crushed Spanish fly, mercury, and what the doctor calls purified venom to a patient's buboes. The patient died 4 hours later. The doctor's note: subject exhibited extreme distress. Venom application likely accelerated decline. Further testing required with reduced concentration. Further testing on dying people, without their knowledge or consent. This wasn't unique. Evidence suggests multiple plague doctors engaged in similar experimentation, though most were careful not to document it as explicitly. The combination of factors was perfect for ethical violations. Patients were dying anyway. Oversight was non-existent. Desperation for a cure justified extreme measures. And the experimental subjects couldn't complain afterward because they were dead. The rationalization was straightforward. These people are dying. Nothing works. If I try something new and they die, I've lost nothing, they were dying anyway. But if something works, even once, I might save thousands. The mathematics seem to justify experimentation. One life risked for potential knowledge that saves many. Except the one life wasn't volunteering, and the risk was certainty. Nostradamus, before becoming famous as a prophet, worked as a plague doctor in southern France. His treatments were considered radical. He opposed bloodletting, prescribed unusual remedies, and seemed to be testing theories rather than following established practice. Some of his patients survived at anomalously high rates, which he used to build his reputation. But accounts from people who knew him suggest his methods weren't always clearly explained to patients. He would try different combinations of treatments on different patients with similar symptoms, then note which worked better. This is foundational to modern clinical trials. It's also experimentation without informed consent. Records from Venice hint at more disturbing practices. A plague doctor there maintained unusually detailed notes about symptom progression, recording exact times when buboes appeared, when skin darkened, when patients became delirious, when breathing changed. The detail suggests he was observing rather than treating. watching the disease progress with clinical detachment, gathering data that might lead to understanding. Patients and families assumed he was evaluating treatment effectiveness. He may have been, but the notes read like observation logs. Some entries mention providing standard treatment to one subject, withholding treatment from comparable subject for observation purposes. He was conducting control experiments. On human beings, the ethical framework was different then. Medieval medicine didn't have concepts like informed consent or patient autonomy. Physicians were authorities who decided treatment. Patients were recipients who received it. The idea that patients should understand and agree to procedures wasn't part of medical culture. So plague doctors testing new treatments weren't violating contemporary ethics. Those ethics didn't exist yet. But causing additional suffering was wrong even by medieval standards, and some experiments clearly did that. Trying increasingly concentrated mercury compounds on patients to see at what dosage improvement occurred. Mercury is toxic. Higher concentrations meant poisoning patients faster. Applying caustic substances to buboes in varying strengths to determine optimal scarring. The caustics burned flesh, adding agony to dying. Testing whether certain prayers or rituals improved outcomes by providing them to some patients and withholding them from others. The patients denied prayers, didn't know they were part of an experiment. One disturbing case from Florence involved a plague doctor who seems to have been testing transmission vectors. He would treat patients with different levels of protective precaution, then document whether he became infected. This isn't clearly stated, but the notes suggest he was deliberately exposing himself variably to determine what level of contact was dangerous. This meant potentially infecting himself to gather data, arguably noble, but it also meant potentially spreading infection to others afterward if he did become a carrier. His own risk was his choice. The risk he posed to others wasn't. The surgical experiments were perhaps worst. Some plague doctors attempted to remove buboes entirely, cutting out swollen lymph nodes. This was agonizing, often led to worse infections, and patients usually died anyway. But the doctors were learning anatomy, understanding how the lymphatic system was affected, gathering knowledge that wouldn't be formally documented for centuries. The patients suffered for that knowledge. Their suffering produced understanding that eventually, much later, contributed to medical progress. Does that justify it? Medieval plague doctors thought yes. Modern ethics says no. The gap between those positions is where the discomfort lives. The desperation for a cure created permission structures that allowed experimentation. Families begged for anything that might work. Plague doctors had literally nothing that reliably helped. So, trying wild combinations, testing theories, experimenting with new approaches seemed reasonable. And if you're already trying new things, why not document results? And if you're documenting results, why not be systematic? And if you're being systematic, you're conducting experiments. The slide from desperate treatment to unethical experimentation wasn't a leap. It was a gradual slope that many plague doctors descended without noticing they'd crossed lines. Good intentions don't prevent ethical violations, and crisis situations create pressure to prioritize results over process, outcomes over consent, knowledge over individual rights. Some plague doctors recognize the ethical problems. A letter from a Paris doctor to a colleague survives, discussing the morality of trying unproven treatments. His position was that desperation justified risk-taking, but patients deserved to know what was being tried. He apparently asked permission, explained that treatments were untested, and accepted refusal. This was extraordinary for the era. It was also probably rare. The manuscript found in Prague ended abruptly at entry 67. The final note read, "I have learned much about death's progression, but nothing about preventing it. Perhaps that is the only knowledge available." Then, nothing more. The doctor's name wasn't recorded. His fate is unknown. His experiments ended, either because he died or because he gave up. The knowledge gained from plague doctor experimentation is difficult to assess. Some genuinely useful observations emerged. Isolation helps, cleanliness matters, certain herbs have mild beneficial effects. But most experiments produced nothing, except additional suffering. The patients didn't benefit. Future patients rarely benefited. The plague doctors gained experience and data that usually proved useless. What remains is the uncomfortable question: how much suffering is acceptable in pursuit of knowledge that might save lives? Medieval plague doctors answered, quite a lot. Modern ethics answers, much less than that. But we live in different times, with different rules, and the luxury of judging historical figures who operated under incomprehensible pressure. The experiments happened. They were usually unethical by any standard. They occasionally produced minor insights. And they showed how easily healing professions can slip into harm when oversight disappears and desperation justifies everything. Milan, 1349. Authorities arrested a plague doctor named Antonio for fraud. He'd been falsifying death certificates in exchange for payment. The evidence was clear. Testimony from multiple families, documents in his own hand, money that couldn't be explained. What made the case extraordinary wasn't the crime, but what they found in his quarters: letters from 12 other plague doctors in different cities across northern Italy and southern France. The letters used careful language, but the meaning was clear. Warnings about which cities were investigating corruption, advice about how to hide assets, information about which officials could be bribed, recommendations about moving to new cities when scrutiny increased, and most disturbing, coded references to our brotherhood and maintaining solidarity against those who don't understand our necessary work. Historians examining these letters believe they document Europe's first medical crime network, plague doctors across multiple cities operating with shared interests and mutual protection. The network wasn't formal. No one had organized it deliberately. It emerged organically from plague doctors, recognizing they had more in common with each other than with the communities they served. The formation made sense. Plague doctors were outsiders, immigrants, failures, criminals offered pardons. Normal society rejected them. Officials viewed them with suspicion. Communities feared them. So, they formed their own community, finding solidarity with the only people who understood their reality. This solidarity served beneficial purposes: sharing medical observations, supporting each other emotionally, providing professional advice. But it also created insulation from accountability. Evidence of the network appears scattered through historical records. Letters between plague doctors in Venice and Florence discussing treatment approaches. Accounts books showing plague doctors lending each other money. City records noting that plague doctors arriving from other places always seemed to find immediate housing and employment, suggesting prior arrangements. Wills leaving substantial bequests to plague doctors the testator had never met, connected only through professional ties. The network served as information exchange. Plague doctors would share which treatments seemed to work, which cities paid best, which officials were amenable to bribes. This information helped them survive and maximize income. But it also helped them evade consequences. If a plague doctor faced investigation in one city, colleagues elsewhere would be warned. The doctor would often flee before prosecution, arriving in a new city with recommendations from plague doctors already there, vouching for qualifications that might be entirely fabricated. Records from Barcelona describe this pattern explicitly. A plague doctor arrived with letters of introduction from 3 doctors in Italian cities. The letters praised his skill and experience. Barcelona hired him based on these recommendations. Months later, authorities discovered the letters were lies. The doctor had no medical training, had been run out of 2 cities for theft, and the letters were provided by colleagues protecting him from consequences. When confronted, the Barcelona plague doctors who'd vouched for him claimed they'd been deceived. The investigation concluded they'd known and had actively participated in the deception because professional solidarity trumped honesty. The network coordinated wage negotiations in ways that would seem familiar to modern labor organizers. Plague doctors in neighboring cities would share information about contracts, ensuring they didn't undercut each other's compensation. In some cases, they explicitly agreed not to accept positions unless cities met certain payment standards. This was effective leverage. Cities, desperate for plague doctors, had little choice but to meet demands. The network transformed individual plague doctors' weak bargaining positions into collective strength. But the same coordination that raised wages also facilitated corruption. Groups of plague doctors would operate systematic exploitation schemes. One would identify wealthy families in plague houses, Another would offer to falsify death certificates for payment. A third would serve as intermediary to avoid direct connection. The profits would be split. If one got caught, others would provide alibis or character witnesses. The network made individual corruption safer and more profitable. A case from Genoa suggests coordination went further. Investigators found evidence that plague doctors were deliberately misreporting plague severity in certain districts. The motive appeared to be manipulating property values. Declaring areas plague-free made property cheap, which network members or their associates would purchase, then later sell when plague moved elsewhere and the area recovered. This required multiple plague doctors falsifying records in coordinated ways. Individual corruption was one thing. Systematic fraud affecting entire neighborhoods was something else. The psychological dynamics of group behavior were at work. Individuals might hesitate to exploit vulnerable families, but if colleagues were doing it and facing no consequences, the behavior became normalized. The network created echo chambers where corruption was rationalized, justified, treated as necessary rather than wrong. Plague doctors who objected were excluded, labeled as not understanding the realities of their work, sometimes threatened. The network protected itself by enforcing conformity. Whistleblowers existed, but faced severe retaliation. A plague doctor in Venice reported colleagues who were looting plague houses systematically. The colleagues were investigated but not punished. The city needed them. The whistleblower, however, found himself ostracized. Other plague doctors refused to work with him. When he sought positions in other cities, letters preceded him warning about his unreliability. He eventually abandoned the profession, unable to find work because the network had blacklisted him. Class dynamics reinforced the network's cohesion. Plague doctors were predominantly lower class, outsiders, people who'd never had professional status before. The network provided identity and belonging that society otherwise denied them. They were protecting each other because nobody else would protect them. This made the network resilient. Breaking it would require offering plague doctors something better than what they'd built themselves. Cities never did. The network also shared genuinely useful medical information. Letters between plague doctors contain observations about symptom progression, notes about which aromatic mixtures seemed most protective, advice about costume maintenance. Some of the earliest proto-epidemiological thinking appears in these letters, plague doctors noting patterns about transmission, discussing whether certain behaviors increased infection risk, sharing survival strategies. The network contributed to medical knowledge, even while facilitating corruption. What's remarkable is how thoroughly the network operated outside official structures, while being essential to those structures. Cities relied on plague doctors, but couldn't control them. The doctors had organized themselves into a parallel system with its own rules, loyalty structures, and codes of conduct. They weren't accountable to cities or patients, but to each other. And because cities were desperate, this autonomy couldn't be challenged effectively. The network's ultimate fate is unclear. As plague outbreaks became less frequent and the profession became more regulated, the informal organization probably dissolved. Later, plague doctors were more likely to be trained physicians, subject to professional oversight, integrated into medical guilds. The desperate improvisational period that created the network ended, and with it the conditions that sustained it. But for several generations, across multiple countries, plague doctors operated as something like an organized criminal enterprise embedded within official medical response. They healed and exploited, helped and harmed, served cities while serving themselves first. The network made them more effective at both. When the plague finally receded, when cities no longer needed plague doctors desperately enough to tolerate anything, questions emerged. What happens to them now? Did they face consequences? Did they disappear? Did they become something else? The answers are complicated, and they reveal as much about society's relationship with necessary evils as about the doctors themselves. The plague didn't end suddenly. It retreated gradually, like a tide going out, leaving wreckage in its wake. Venice saw its last major outbreak in 1348, subside by early 1349. Florence took longer, Paris longer still. But even in cities declared plague-free, sporadic cases would appear, months or years later, a neighborhood flaring up unexpectedly, a few deaths, then nothing. The pattern was unpredictable enough that cities kept plague doctors employed long after the worst had passed, just in case. The transition period was strange for everyone, but especially for plague doctors. One week you're examining 50 bodies, the next week 20, then 10. Then you go 3 days without being called anywhere. The work that consumed every waking hour suddenly has gaps. You have time to think. That turns out to be worse. Cities began terminating contracts as the need decreased. Sometimes with ceremony, a formal letter thanking the doctor for service, perhaps a small pension if they'd served well and the city could afford generosity. More often, contracts simply weren't renewed. You showed up for payment 1 week and were told your services were no longer required. No pension. No compensation for the months or years you'd spent in isolation. Just dismissal, as if you'd been hired to repair roads rather than walk through hell daily. Some plague doctors tried returning to their former lives. This rarely worked. A barber surgeon who'd spent 2 years as a plague doctor attempted to reopen his shop in Florence. Former customers avoided him. The shop stayed empty for weeks until he gave up and left the city entirely. The fear of contamination was partly superstitious. People believed plague doctors carried corruption that couldn't be washed away. But it was also practical. The doctor had been exposed constantly. Who knew if he was truly safe? Better to find a barber who hadn't spent years breathing plague air. Plague doctors with families faced impossible reunions. Imagine being separated for 2 years. Your spouse has grieved you as effectively dead. Your children have grown up without you. You return, but you're not the person who left. You've changed in ways that can't be explained to people who haven't experienced what you have. Conversations feel hollow. Touch feels wrong. You can't sleep in the same room because nightmares make you violent. Within months, many plague doctors left again, unable to bridge the gap between who they'd been and who they'd become. Others never tried returning. They continued working as plague specialists, traveling to regions where plague still raged. This created a nomadic subclass of professional plague doctors who moved from outbreak to outbreak across Europe, Venice to Genoa to Barcelona to Marseille, following disease like merchants following trade routes. These doctors accumulated wealth. Each contract added to previous earnings, but they also accumulated trauma in layers that never healed. Some worked for decades, becoming experts in a field nobody wanted expertise in. A few plague doctors couldn't stop even when the plague did. They'd wear their costumes in cities where plague had been gone for months. They'd continue isolation practices that were no longer necessary. Records mention a doctor in Paris who lived in his designated plague quarters for 3 years after his contract ended, maintaining the same routines, donning the costume each morning, making rounds through empty streets, returning each evening to document nothing in his ledger. When officials finally forced him out, he simply walked into the countryside and was never seen again. The high pay and authority were difficult to surrender. Plague doctors had been powerful, able to enter anywhere, command respect through fear, earn substantial wages. Returning to normal medical practice meant accepting lower status, less money, and accountability to guilds and regulations. Some couldn't make that adjustment. They became bitter, angry at cities that had needed them desperately, then discarded them casually. Cities' treatment of former plague doctors varied dramatically. Venice established small pensions for doctors who'd served faithfully and survived. The amounts weren't generous, but they represented acknowledgement of service rendered. Florence provided nothing, contracts ended, and doctors were expected to simply move on. Some cities went further in the other direction. Once the crisis passed and normal accountability returned, investigations began into plague doctors' conduct during the emergency. Doctors who'd stolen, extorted, or abused authority during the chaos suddenly faced prosecution. This created a strange situation. The same doctor who'd been essential and untouchable during the plague became criminal and disposable after. Some fled before they could be arrested. Others faced trials that revealed the extent of corruption that had been tolerated out of necessity. A plague doctor in Avignon was executed for theft and fraud, crimes everyone knew he'd committed while working, but which were only prosecuted after he was no longer needed. The records from a Venice City Council meeting in 1349 discuss what to do with remaining plague doctors. One councilman proposed generous pensions and official thanks. Another suggested paying them to leave the city permanently, essentially bribing them to become someone else's problem. A third made a proposal, disturbing enough that the details were redacted from official records. Whatever he suggested, it was dark enough that the council wanted no documentation. The vote records from that meeting were deliberately destroyed. We know the meeting happened. We know they discussed plague doctors' fates. We don't know what was decided or why they felt the need to hide it. This ambiguity captures the fundamental problem. Plague doctors had been necessary evils. Society needed them during crisis, creating a profession with extraordinary power and minimal oversight. But when crisis ended, that power became threatening rather than essential. The same authority that saved lives during plague could be abused during peace. Cities had to decide, do we honor these people for service under impossible conditions, or do we eliminate the threat they represent? Many cities chose a middle path. Forget them. Stop employing them. Stop discussing them. Let them disappear into history. For plague doctors, this meant living in limbo, no longer needed. Not quite rejected, but definitely not welcomed. Some found new purposes. Others dissolved into poverty and obscurity. A few became legends, their names remembered while most vanished completely from records. The dying stopped. The dead remained dead. And the people who'd walked between those states found they belonged fully to neither. They'd crossed a threshold that couldn't be recrossed. They'd become the beak, and removing the costume didn't make them human again in society's eyes, or often in their own. The Black Death of 1347 to 1351 killed perhaps half of Europe. It was the worst, but it wasn't the last. Plague returned again and again. 1361, 1369. Recurrent outbreaks throughout the 15th century, major epidemics in the 17th century. Each time, cities needed plague doctors. Each time, the profession re-emerged, adapted, evolved. London, 1665. The Great Plague arrived, and the city employed plague doctors, using methods refined over 3 centuries. The costume had evolved, beaks were shorter, more practical. The coat was standardized canvas treated with wax. The role itself had changed. These weren't desperate improvisations anymore. London had official plague doctor positions written into city regulations. The job had become institutionalized. The 17th century plague doctors were different from their medieval predecessors. Many had actual medical training. They worked within established frameworks rather than operating as autonomous authorities. Their powers were more limited. They couldn't seal homes unilaterally, couldn't confiscate property without oversight. The profession had been tamed, regulated, brought under control in ways that wouldn't have been possible during the chaos of the Black Death. But the core function remained. Someone had to enter plague houses, examine victims, certify deaths, track the disease. The work was still dangerous, still isolating, still traumatic. The costume was still disturbing. The beak still meant death was near. Some things don't change regardless of centuries passing. Marseille, 1720. The last major plague outbreak in Western Europe arrived via a merchant ship that authorities failed to quarantine properly. The city employed plague doctors using methods that by then were over 400 years old. But these doctors had access to better anatomical knowledge, improved record-keeping systems, and the beginnings of statistical analysis. They weren't just treating and documenting. They were actively trying to understand transmission patterns, test interventions, collect data that could inform response. One Marseille plague doctor kept meticulous logs that read almost like modern epidemiological studies. He tracked which neighborhoods showed initial cases, mapped the spread, noted correlations between containment measures and mortality rates. He couldn't explain the mechanism. Germ theory was still a century away, but he understood that patterns existed and could be documented. His work wouldn't be recognized as scientifically significant until the 20th century, when researchers discovered his journals and realized he'd been conducting proto-epidemiology without the conceptual framework to understand what he was doing. The profession varied dramatically by region. Italian plague doctors maintained closer ties to the medieval tradition. Elaborate costumes, mystical treatments, integration, with religious authorities. French plague doctors became more bureaucratic, functioning as government officials who happened to work with disease. German practices mixed both approaches, depending on the region. Eastern European plague doctors operated with less oversight and more autonomy, closer to the original chaotic model. Training programs emerged in some cities. Venice created a formal course for plague doctor candidates in the 16th century. It covered protective measures, symptom recognition, record-keeping, and legal authority. The course lasted 2 weeks. Students who completed it received certification that improved their employment prospects across Italian city-states. This was probably Europe's first specialized medical certification program, created specifically for plague response. Some cities created permanent plague doctor positions that existed whether plague was present or not. The doctor would handle other medical duties during healthy periods, but was required to maintain their costume and training in case plague returned. This was public health thinking, preparing for disaster before it arrives, rather than improvising after. The positions were prestigious in some places, stigmatized in others, depending on local culture and recent plague history. The treatments evolved slowly, too slowly. Bloodletting persisted well into the 18th century despite accumulating evidence it didn't help. The aromatic beak stuffing continued even as its theoretical basis was questioned. But some progress occurred. Quarantine became more sophisticated and effective. Protective clothing improved. Record-keeping became systematic enough to enable actual analysis. The profession was learning, though the learning took centuries and countless deaths. Germ theory's emergence in the 19th century fundamentally undermined plague doctors' rationale. If disease was caused by microorganisms rather than bad air, the beak made no sense. If transmission was via bacteria rather than miasma, the aromatic stuffing was irrelevant. The profession's theoretical foundation collapsed. Yet even then, some practices proved prescient. Isolation worked, and doctors had known it worked for centuries without understanding why. Protective clothing prevented transmission, even if the mechanism wasn't understood. Systematic documentation enabled disease tracking, regardless of whether doctors knew what they were tracking. The last official plague doctor appointment in Europe was probably in the late 19th century, though documentation is scattered. But in 1910, something extraordinary happened in Manchuria. Pneumonic plague broke out. The Chinese government appointed a Western-trained physician, Wu Liante, to contain it. He designed protective equipment for medical workers, based partly on historical plague doctor costumes, partly on emerging germ theory understanding. The result looked eerily similar: masks, full body covering, gloves. Photography had just become common. Pictures from the Manchuria outbreak show medical workers in gear that wouldn't look out of place in 14th century Venice, standing next to modern hospital facilities. Two eras colliding in the same image. Wu Liante's equipment worked. The outbreak was contained, and modern infectious disease specialists still wear protective equipment descended directly from plague doctors' costumes. The beaked mask is gone, replaced by N95 respirators and surgical masks. But the principle remains: create a barrier between medical worker and infectious agent. The plague doctors got the mechanism completely wrong, but the instinct was correct. The profession didn't die, it evolved. Modern epidemiologists, infection control specialists, public health officials conducting contact tracing during outbreaks, these are plague doctors' direct descendants. The costume changed. The understanding improved. The name disappeared. But the function persists. When disease threatens, someone has to track it, contain it, treat it, document it, risk exposure to protect others. The line from medieval plague doctor to modern pandemic response worker is more direct than most people realize. We've refined the tools and improved the knowledge, but we're doing the same essential work. Fighting invisible enemies, containing spread, processing death at scale, maintaining records in chaos. And still, after all these centuries, wearing distinctive clothing that marks us as walking toward what others flee from. The profession wouldn't die because the need wouldn't die. As long as disease exists, someone has to stand between it and society. The beak was just one answer to that eternal need. We've developed better answers, but we haven't escaped the need itself. Close your eyes and picture a plague doctor. You can see it clearly, can't you? The beak, the dark coat, the wide-brimmed hat, the glass eyepieces reflecting nothing. Even if you've never consciously studied plague doctor imagery, you know what they look like. The image has penetrated cultural consciousness so thoroughly that it's become archetypal, instantly recognizable across continents and generations. Why this image? Why not other medieval medical figures? Why not leper hospital workers, or battlefield surgeons, or any other profession that dealt with death and disease? What makes the plague doctor specifically so powerful that it's survived 6 centuries in collective memory, while most historical figures fade within decades? The psychology starts with the mask itself. Human brains are hardwired to read faces. We do it automatically, constantly, finding faces in clouds and toast and random patterns. We need faces to determine threat, to identify emotion, to connect with other humans. The plague doctor mask denies all of that. It presents something shaped like a face but completely alien. The beak especially triggers deep unease. It's too long, too sharp, too reminiscent of carrion birds. Our brains register it as wrong on a level that bypasses conscious thought. The rest of the costume amplifies this wrongness. The dark coat eliminates human proportions. The gloves hide hands, removing one of our primary tools for reading intent. The complete coverage makes the figure genderless, ageless, featureless. It could be anyone under there. It could be no one. The costume transforms a person into an object, a symbol, something other than human. And that symbol represents our deepest fear. Death that can't be avoided, negotiated with, or understood. Plague doctors appeared when death was imminent. They were death's administrators, its bookkeepers, its heralds. The costume became associated not just with disease but with inevitability. When the beak appeared, hope disappeared. The image first entered art during the plague years themselves. Religious paintings of plague scenes included plague doctors as markers of divine punishment. Their beaked forms stood among dying masses, pointing with their canes, marking doors, serving as visual shorthand for catastrophe. Renaissance artists refined the image, making it more stylized, more symbolic. By the Baroque period, plague doctors appeared in theatrical productions as figures of dark comedy and horror, the costume already understood as inherently dramatic. Romantic-era writers rediscovered medieval horror and fell in love with the plague doctor. Gothic literature featured beaked figures prominently. They represented the perfect Gothic combination: historical authenticity mixed with nightmare imagery, rational medicine twisted into something supernatural. Edgar Allan Poe's The Mask of the Red Death doesn't explicitly mention plague doctors, but the Red Death figure wears a costume, clearly inspired by them: a mask, a shroud, an appearance that terrifies everyone present. The 20th century brought plague doctors into new media. Horror films discovered the costume's visual power. The silhouette reads immediately as threatening, even in darkness. The beak provides instant recognition. Directors learned that plague doctors could create fear, without dialogue, without movement, just through presence. Put a beaked figure in the background of a scene, and audiences feel unease without consciously knowing why. Video games adopted plague doctors as character design shorthand for plague zones, dark medicine, medieval horror, or corrupted healing. The image appears in dozens of games across multiple genres. Sometimes as enemies, sometimes as quest givers, sometimes as player costumes. The visual is so distinctive that it requires no explanation. Players understand immediately what the costume signifies. Modern street art and alternative aesthetics embraced plague doctors. The image appears on murals, prints, tattoos, fashion. It's become divorced from its historical context, transformed into pure aesthetic, creepy, distinctive, vaguely steampunk, historically grounded but fantastical. The costume means different things to different subcultures, but it always means something. It's never neutral. COVID-19 brought plague doctors roaring back into relevance. The image became a meme, appearing in social media posts as commentary on pandemic response. Sometimes serious doctors wearing historical costumes to emphasize historical continuity. Sometimes satirical plague doctors edited into modern settings, highlighting absurdities of contemporary life. Sometimes dark the beak as reminder that pandemics have always killed and always will. The costume became shorthand for pandemic anxiety, for medical uncertainty, for the feeling that we'd fallen backward into medieval helplessness despite modern technology. Psychologists studying fear responses have found that plague doctor imagery triggers reactions comparable to horror movie monsters and dangerous animals. But unlike fictional threats, the plague doctor was real. Unlike extinct predators, the threat it represents, pandemic disease, remains active. The image taps into fears that are simultaneously historical and immediate, grounded in past trauma but relevant to present anxiety. Cultural historians note that very few historical images achieve this kind of permanence. Most fade within a generation or two. The plague doctor has persisted across 6 centuries of radical cultural change, surviving the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the digital age. It's adapted to every artistic medium invented: painting, print, photography, film, digital art. It works in every context: horror, history, medicine, comedy, fashion. This versatility suggests the image taps into something fundamental, rather than culturally specific. What the plague doctor symbolizes keeps shifting. Sometimes it's medical futility doctors who couldn't cure, treating with methods that harmed. Sometimes it's courage people who walked toward death when everyone else fled. Sometimes it's corruption healers who became predators, using crisis for personal gain. Sometimes it's transformation, the costume as boundary between human and role, self and duty. The image is flexible enough to carry multiple contradictory meanings simultaneously. There's also commercialization. Plague doctor costumes are popular for Halloween, cosplay, themed parties. Decorative masks sell in museum shops. The historical horror has been aestheticized, transformed from tragedy into commodity. Whether this is disrespectful or simply how culture processes trauma is debatable. We turn disasters into entertainment to make them manageable. The plague doctor, once genuinely terrifying, becomes a costume children wear. This might be how societies heal, by transforming trauma into something controllable. But the image never fully loses its darkness. Even in comedy, even in fashion, the beak carries associations: death, disease, pandemic, helplessness in the face of invisible threats. The costume reminds us that we're not as safe as we think, not as advanced as we believe, not as different from our medieval ancestors as we'd prefer. It says, "This happened before, it will happen again, and when it does, someone will wear something like this mask and walk toward what you flee." That's why we can't forget the plague doctor. The image survived because it represents something permanent about human existence. Disease remains, crisis recurs, fear persists. And always, someone has to stand between society and catastrophe, wearing whatever costume we've created to separate the helper from the human underneath. The beak haunts us because what it represents never stopped being relevant. 6 centuries haven't made pandemics impossible. They've just changed the mask we wear while fighting them. History is written by survivors, and during the Black Death, survivors were too busy surviving to write much down. Most plague doctors were illiterate or barely literate. They were barbers, failures, criminals, not scholars. The ones who could write were usually too exhausted or traumatized to maintain detailed journals. What we know about plague doctors comes from fragments, glimpses, shadows of a profession that operated mostly in darkness and left little trace. The gaps in documentation are staggering. We don't know how many plague doctors existed. Estimates range from hundreds to thousands across Europe, but these are guesses based on partial city records and extrapolation. We don't know their survival rates with any precision. Some cities kept track, most didn't. We don't have personal accounts from the vast majority, no journals describing their daily experiences, no letters explaining their motivations, no memoirs reflecting on their service. What we lack specifically would answer crucial questions. Detailed medical records showing which treatments were attempted and their outcomes would tell us whether any interventions actually helped. Complete employment records would reveal who these people were, where they came from, how long they survived. Personal writings would illuminate their psychological states, their moral reasoning, their human complexity. Without these, we're assembling a picture from scattered puzzle pieces, with most of the image missing. Why the gaps? Destruction, mostly. During plague outbreaks, anything potentially contaminated was burned. Documents from plague houses, ledgers kept by plague doctors, even city records that officials had handled all went into fires meant to purify and prevent further spread. Entire archives disappeared when cities were devastated. Venice lost substantial records when plague-stricken districts were abandoned and later looted. Florence's documentation was scattered when governmental structures collapsed temporarily. Some destruction was deliberate, but not disease-related. Records that documented corruption, abuses of power, or administrative failures were quietly destroyed once the crisis passed. Cities didn't want evidence of what they'd tolerated out of necessity. Plague doctors who'd committed crimes during the pandemic might burn their own records before fleeing. Families of doctors who died in disgrace might destroy journals to protect reputations. What survived did so almost by accident. Religious archives preserved some records because churches maintained better organizational continuity than secular governments. Documents valuable enough to be copied, city contracts, official regulations, legal proceedings, survived in multiple locations, so even if originals were destroyed, copies remained. Financial records persisted because money matters even during catastrophe, and payment disputes required documentation. The fragments that remain are tantalizing. A journal from a Venetian plague doctor exists in fragments 40 pages out of what was probably several hundred. It ends mid-sentence. Today I examined a family where the father showed no symptoms but, and then nothing. The rest is lost. We'll never know what he observed, what happened to that family, what conclusion he was building toward. City account books contain cryptic entries. Payment to G for special services rendered in the children's ward, amount withheld pending investigation. What services? What investigation? No further documentation exists. The entry raises questions it will never answer, hints at stories that vanished with whoever could have explained them. References to documents that no longer exist appear frequently. As detailed in Dr. M's report of March 1349, appears in a City Council meeting record. Dr. M's report is gone. We know it existed. We know it was significant enough to reference in official proceedings. We'll never read it. Historical scholarship is full of these ghosts, documents we know existed, sometimes know the contents of generally, but cannot access because they've been lost for centuries. In 2019, renovators working on a hospital in Prague found a sealed basement. Inside was a locked iron chest. Inside the chest were documents from 1,349 plague doctor records, treatment notes, something that might be experimental logs. But they're written in a code, or cipher, that hasn't been deciphered despite years of effort. Linguistic analysis suggests it's not a standard medieval code. It might be personal shorthand, might be deliberate obfuscation, might be notation system unique to this particular doctor. One line appears repeatedly throughout the documents, translated roughly as, "what we did in the children's ward." Context suggests something irregular happened, something the doctor felt needed to be hidden but also documented. The full meaning remains locked behind indecipherable symbols. The documents sit in a Prague archive, tantalizing researchers with secrets they might never reveal. Historians have tried filling gaps through extrapolation. If Venice employed 20 plague doctors, and Florence had similar population and plague severity, Florence probably employed a comparable number. If survival rates in documented cities averaged 30%, undocumented cities probably saw similar rates. These methods provide rough estimates, but can't replace actual evidence. Every extrapolation involves assumptions that might be completely wrong. Recent discoveries occasionally surface. A letter found in a private collection, a journal discovered in a monastery library that hadn't been catalogued properly, a city archive that digitizes its holdings and makes them searchable, revealing plague doctor references that had been buried in unindexed documents. Each discovery adds pieces to the puzzle, but the puzzle is so vast that even major finds only fill tiny portions of the missing image. The frustration for historians is knowing that definitive answers once existed. Somewhere, at some point, complete records were written, lists of every plague doctor employed, detailed accounts of their activities, personal testimonies explaining their choices and experiences. All of it existed, and almost all of it was destroyed, lost, or remains hidden in archives waiting to be discovered, or in codes waiting to be broken. What we think we know about plague doctors is interpretation built on fragments. The stories told earlier in this documentary are the best reconstruction possible from available evidence, but they're reconstruction, not perfect knowledge. And beyond what we can reconstruct lies vast darkness, questions that might never be answered, stories that might never be told, truths that might remain forever hidden. The missing records aren't just frustrating, they're part of the story itself. What we lost tells us something about how plague was experienced, what people wanted to forget, what they felt needed to be hidden. The gaps are information too, just information we can't fully read. Academic conferences about plague doctors can get surprisingly heated. Historians who've spent careers studying the same sources come to completely different conclusions. They read identical documents and see opposite meanings. The debates aren't about minor details, they're fundamental disagreements about whether plague doctors helped or harmed, whether they were heroes or villains, whether the profession represented progress or catastrophe. The most contentious debate: did plague doctors actually reduce plague mortality, or did they make things worse? One side argues that quarantine enforcement, even imperfect, slowed transmission enough to save thousands of lives. Statistical analysis of cities with active plague doctor programs shows marginally lower death rates compared to cities without organized response. The difference is small, but measurable, suggesting plague doctors' containment efforts mattered despite their medical treatments being useless or harmful. The opposing side uses the same statistics and reaches opposite conclusions. Yes, cities with plague doctors showed slightly lower mortality, but correlation isn't causation. These were also wealthier cities that could afford organized response, that had better infrastructure generally, that likely had lower death rates for multiple reasons, unrelated to plague doctors. Factor out wealth and infrastructure, and the plague doctor effect disappears. Worse, the treatments plague doctors administered, bloodletting, toxic poultices, surgical interventions, may have killed patients who might have recovered otherwise. The quarantines they enforced trapped healthy family members with infected ones, increasing household transmission. Their presence caused panic that led to people hiding symptoms and avoiding treatment entirely. Added up, and plague doctors might have caused more deaths than they prevented. Both arguments use rigorous methodology. Both cite extensive evidence. Both are published in peer-reviewed journals. Both can't be right. Both might be wrong. The data is too incomplete and contaminated by confounding variables to prove either position definitively. Another fundamental disagreement: what percentage of plague doctors were corrupt versus conscientious? Some historians emphasize the corruption, the theft, the extortion, the abuse of power. They argue this wasn't aberration but norm, that the profession attracted and rewarded the worst kind of opportunists. City records are full of complaints and prosecutions. The structural incentives favored corruption. Therefore, most plague doctors were probably predators using crisis for personal gain. Other historians read the same records differently. Yes, complaints exist, but complaints are documented. Competent service, isn't it, generates no paperwork. The historical record is biased toward recording problems, not routine functioning. For every plague doctor prosecuted for theft, dozens worked honestly without generating documentation. The fact that cities repeatedly employed plague doctors and often provided pensions suggests most performed adequately. If corruption was truly endemic, cities would have found alternatives. The debate extends to motivation. Were plague doctors primarily motivated by money, by altruism, by desperation, by opportunity? Evidence exists for all motivations, but historians disagree on which was dominant. Some emphasize the high wages and argue financial incentive was primary. Others emphasize the mortality risk and argue only genuine commitment explains why anyone accepted such dangerous work. Still others focus on the criminal and marginal backgrounds of many plague doctors and argue desperation left them no better options. These aren't just academic quibbles, they fundamentally shape how we understand the profession. If plague doctors were mostly corrupt, they represent how crisis enables exploitation. If they were mostly conscientious, they represent human courage under impossible circumstances. The truth is probably that both types existed, but historians can't agree on the proportions, and the proportions matter for interpreting what the profession meant. A third major debate: did plague doctor work advance medical knowledge or retard it? The argument for progress points to their systematic observation, their record-keeping, their accidental discoveries about isolation and protective equipment effectiveness. Some plague doctors kept detailed notes about symptom progression, transmission patterns, and intervention outcomes. This proto-epidemiological thinking laid groundwork for later scientific medicine. The profession forced people to think systematically about disease response, creating frameworks that evolved into modern public health. The counter-argument is that plague doctors entrenched pseudoscience at a critical moment when medicine might have moved toward empiricism faster. Their authority validated worthless treatments, giving official sanction to practices that didn't work. They operated within humoral theory and miasma theory when evidence was already suggesting these frameworks were wrong. By institutionalizing medieval medical approaches, they delayed the shift toward experimental methods and evidence-based practice. Medicine might have advanced faster without plague doctors giving credibility to superstition. Both positions find support. The question is emphasis. Do you focus on the seeds of good practice, buried in mostly bad practice, or on the bad practice that dominated and delayed progress? These debates persist because evidence is incomplete and interpretation is subjective. Historians bring their own perspectives shaped by their era, their disciplines, their personal views to historical sources. Social historians see power and exploitation. Medical historians see knowledge, production, and professional evolution. Cultural historians see symbolism and collective psychology. They're all reading the same documents and seeing what their frameworks predispose them to see. New methodologies haven't resolved debates so much as created new ones. Statistical analysis of mortality rates across cities enables more rigorous hypothesis testing, but requires assumptions about data quality and comparability that historians dispute. Psychological analysis of plague doctor writings illuminates mental states, but involves applying modern concepts to medieval people who thought differently. Archaeological evidence from plague sites provides physical data, but needs interpretation that connects it to documentary sources in contested ways. What makes these debates fascinating rather than just frustrating is that they reveal how history works. It's not discovering objective truth. It's building interpretations from fragmentary evidence, acknowledging uncertainty, and accepting that multiple valid perspectives can coexist. Plague doctors were complicated. Some helped, some harmed, most did both. The profession contained multitudes, and reducing it to simple judgments misses that complexity. The debates will continue because they can't be definitively resolved with available evidence. Maybe future discoveries will settle some questions. More likely, they'll complicate matters further, providing evidence that supports multiple interpretations simultaneously. That's not failure, it's history being honest about its limitations. And honestly, the ambiguity might be appropriate. Plague doctors operated in moral grey zones. Our inability to judge them cleanly mirrors their inability to navigate cleanly the impossible circumstances they faced. The uncertainty in our historical understanding reflects the uncertainty they lived with every day. The most repeated fact about plague doctors is that they were paid only if patients survived. This appears in books, documentaries, museum exhibits, and countless websites. It's compelling, creates incentive for doctors to actually try to heal, rather than just document death. It's also completely false. No historical evidence supports this claim. City contracts specified fixed wages or per-visit payments, compensation for property from plague houses, and sometimes bonuses for extended service. Patient outcomes weren't part of the payment structure because that would have been absurd. Plague killed nearly everyone, so outcome-based payment would mean no plague doctor earned anything. The myth probably originated from misunderstanding of general medieval medical practice. Some regular physicians had arrangements where payment depended partly on successful treatment. This got confused with plague medicine, where such arrangements would be impossible. Once the myth entered circulation, it spread because it makes narrative sense, feels like it should be true, and few people check primary sources. Truth became subordinate to compelling storytelling. The iconic beaked costume is another area where myth has overtaken reality. Popular culture assumes all plague doctors wore the famous outfit all the time. The truth is more complicated. The beaked mask we recognize was designed around 1619, 3 centuries after the Black Death began. Earlier plague doctors wore various protective clothing, but the standardized beak and coat outfit emerged later and wasn't universal even then. Many plague doctors wore simpler protection or none at all. Regional variation was huge. Some never adopted the costume. Others used it only during major outbreaks. The myth of universal beak wearing comes from visual bias. The dramatic images survived and got copied and referenced repeatedly. Mundane images of doctors in regular clothing don't circulate because they're not visually interesting. We see the beak in historical art and assume it represents common practice when it actually represents the most dramatic version that artists chose to depict. Confirmation bias does the rest. We remember the beaked images and forget or dismiss evidence of variation. Another persistent myth. Plague doctors were all incompetent frauds with no medical training. This contains truth. Many were unqualified, but it's not universal. Records show that some plague doctors had university medical training. Nostradamus was educated. Charles Delorme was court physician to multiple kings. Others had apprenticed with established physicians or had surgical training. The profession attracted a full spectrum from complete charlatans to legitimately qualified doctors. Reducing them all to frauds misses important distinctions. This myth probably comes from Victorian-era historical writing that loved to mock medieval medicine as primitive and superstitious. Victorian historians emphasized the most dramatic and incompetent examples, creating an image of plague doctors as buffoons. Modern historical research has complicated this picture, but the simplified Victorian version circulates more widely because it makes better stories. The claim that all plague doctor treatments were useless is another overgeneralization. Most were indeed useless or actively harmful. Bloodletting didn't help. Toxic poultices killed. Bizarre rituals accomplished nothing. But some practices accidentally worked. Quarantine and isolation reduced transmission. Avoiding contact with bodily fluids limited infection. Ventilating sick rooms helped. Burning contaminated materials removed vectors. Plague doctors got the mechanism completely wrong, but stumbled onto practices that had beneficial effects. Acknowledging this doesn't mean plague medicine was effective. It mostly wasn't. But completely dismissing everything they did ignores that bits of useful practice were mixed into mostly harmful approaches. The truth is more nuanced than either everything was useless or they knew what they were doing. Internet culture has created entirely new myths. Social media circulates facts about plague doctors that have no historical basis, quotes they never said, practices they never performed, stories that are fabricated or heavily embellished. A popular claim that plague doctors carried plague sticks filled with diseases to deliberately spread plague appears nowhere in historical records, but circulates widely online. Photoshopped images of plague doctors in impossible contexts get shared as genuine historical photographs. These modern myths spread because social media rewards compelling content over accurate content. A dramatic false claim gets more engagement than a nuanced true one. Fact-checking takes effort. Most people sharing plague doctor content aren't historians. They're people interested in creepy historical aesthetics who don't verify what they're posting. False information accumulates in layers, each generation of sharing adding new embellishments. Why does debunking matter? Not to diminish plague doctors' fascinating reality, but to understand it more accurately. The true history is often stranger than myth. The actual payment systems plague doctors seizing property legally, cities offering financial incentives structured around risk rather than success, are more interesting than the false survival-based payment story. The reality of costume variation across time and region is more complex and revealing than universal beak wearing. The mixture of competence and incompetence, help and harm, truth and superstition, is more honest than reducing everyone to frauds. Sometimes the real history is more disturbing than fiction. Actual treatments live spiders in poultices, human excrement applied to wounds, surgical procedures without anesthesia are worse than myths suggest. The ethical violations weren't exaggerated, if anything, they were worse than popular understanding acknowledges. The corruption was systemic, not just individual bad actors. Debunking myths sometimes means confronting that reality was darker than fiction. The goal isn't to replace all myths with facts that's impossible and maybe not even desirable. Myths serve functions. They help us process historical horror by simplifying it. They create narratives that make sense when reality was chaotic. But being aware of what's myth versus what's documented helps us think more clearly about what plague doctors actually were and what they represent. The truth is complicated. Plague doctors were desperate improvisations during catastrophe. They helped some, harmed others, mostly just documented death while trying ineffective treatments. They were corrupt and conscientious, cruel and compassionate, necessary and dangerous. The simplified versions, either heroes or villains, either effective or useless, miss this complexity. History is messy. Accepting that messiness, acknowledging what we don't know, separating documented fact from compelling fiction, this is how we get closer to understanding what actually happened. Plague doctors deserve that effort, not because they were heroes, but because they were real people operating in impossible circumstances. And real people are always more complicated than the stories we tell about them. Modern epidemiologists studying historical plague data discovered something unexpected. Cities that rigorously enforced plague doctors' isolation protocols showed mortality rates approximately 30% lower than cities with less organized response. The plague doctors who implemented these measures had no idea why they worked. They operated from completely wrong theories about disease transmission. Yet somehow, their practices saved lives. The protective costume is the most obvious example. Plague doctors believed it filtered poisonous miasma, corrupted air, that carried disease. This theory was entirely incorrect. Plague is bacterial, spread by fleas, and sometimes by respiratory droplets, not by bad air. But the costume worked anyway. The long coat created a barrier that fleas couldn't easily penetrate. The gloves prevented contact with contaminated fluids. The mask kept doctors from touching their faces with contaminated hands. The beak, stuffed with aromatics, maintained distance between doctor and patient, reducing droplet transmission for pneumonic plague variants. They got the mechanism completely wrong, but stumbled onto effective barrier protection through accident and observation. The costume was designed to filter air. It actually prevented physical contact with infection vectors. This wasn't intentional genius, it was luck combined with empirical thinking. They noticed that doctors who wore full protection survived longer and concluded the protection worked, even if their explanation for why was nonsense. Distance protocols were another accidental success. Plague doctors were trained to examine patients using their wooden canes, avoiding direct touch whenever possible. The rationale was preventing miasma transfer. The actual benefit was reducing contact with infected bodily fluids and avoiding flea transfer from patient to doctor. The distance was effective, despite the theory being wrong. Quarantine and isolation core plague doctor responsibilities actually did slow transmission significantly. Medieval understanding was that corrupted air needed to be contained within infected houses. Modern understanding is that bacteria carrying fleas and infected patients needed to be separated from healthy populations. Different explanations, same practical result. Sealing infected homes was cruel and often trapped healthy family members with sick ones, but it also prevented those families from moving through communities and spreading infection further. The measure worked, just not as perfectly as it would have with better implementation. Disposal of contaminated materials was another area where wrong theory produced right action. Plague doctors supervised burning of bedding, clothing, and sometimes entire contents of plague houses. They believed these items retained poisonous air. Actually, these items harbored infected fleas. Burning them destroyed disease vectors. The outcome was correct, even though the reasoning wasn't. Fumigation of plague houses with smoke and aromatic substances might have had some benefit. The theory was that good smells drove out bad air. The reality is that some fumigants might have killed or driven away fleas, though this effect was probably minor. Still, any reduction in flea populations helped, even if plague doctors had no concept of why. The emphasis on avoiding corpses was another accidentally wise practice. Plague doctors were taught to handle bodies minimally, using tools rather than direct contact, and to ensure rapid burial or burning. They believed corpses emitted especially potent miasma. Actually, corpses of plague victims could harbor infected fleas for days, and bodies left exposed allowed fleas to seek new hosts. Quick disposal reduced this vector transmission. Record keeping, while grim, contributed to early epidemiological thinking. Plague doctors tracked which households were infected, when symptoms appeared, how disease spread through neighborhoods. They didn't understand they were mapping bacterial transmission patterns, but their data showed geographic clustering, temporal progression, and correlation between contact and infection. Later scientists analyzing these records could identify transmission dynamics that the plague doctors themselves didn't comprehend. What this teaches us is that empirical observation can produce effective practices even without correct theoretical understanding. Plague doctors noticed what seemed to work and did more of it. They noticed what seemed to make things worse and tried to avoid it. This trial and error approach, while primitive, occasionally succeeded. But we can't romanticize this. The successes were buried in mountains of failure. For every practice that accidentally helped, 10 caused harm. Bloodletting weakened already compromised patients. Toxic poultices added injury to infection. Surgical interventions without antisepsis introduced additional infections. Forced quarantine of healthy, with sick increased household transmission. The psychological damage from authoritarian enforcement created lasting trauma. The philosophical question is whether we can call something good medicine if it helps for the wrong reasons. Modern medical ethics says no, the reasoning matters, not just outcomes. Random chance occasionally producing benefit doesn't constitute knowledge. But historically, this is often how medicine advanced. Practices emerged from wrong theories. Some worked accidentally, observation refined them, and eventually correct understanding caught up. Plague doctors were operating at the edge of medieval knowledge, trying everything they could imagine because nothing established was working. They threw dozens of interventions at plague and noticed which patients seemed to do slightly better, which cities had marginally lower mortality. They couldn't run controlled experiments or understand mechanisms, but they could observe and adapt. What survived from their work: isolation, quarantine, protective clothing, systematic disease tracking, were the practices that actually had effects, even if effects were misattributed. What didn't survive: humoral balancing, miasma, purification, astrological timing, were the practices that never worked, but seemed like they should, based on medieval theory. Medical progress isn't a straight line from ignorance to knowledge. It's a messy accumulation of accidental discoveries, wrong theories that occasionally produce right practices, empirical observations that precede theoretical understanding, and very slow correction of mistakes across generations. Plague doctors were part of that messy process. They contributed to eventual understanding, not through brilliant insight, but through desperate experimentation and careful enough observation that some useful patterns emerged from the noise. We can acknowledge their accidental successes without overstating them. They got some things right for the wrong reasons. They got most things wrong for reasons that seemed right at the time. What matters is that the rare successes persisted and evolved, while the failures eventually, very eventually, were abandoned. That's how knowledge builds, slowly and painfully, across centuries of trial and error. March 2020. A nurse in Lombardy, Italy, posted a photo to social media. She'd just finished a 16-hour shift treating COVID-19 patients. Full protective equipment, gown, gloves, N95 respirator, face shield. Her face showed pressure marks from the mask, exhaustion in her eyes. The caption was simple: "Now I understand the plague doctor." Within hours, the post went viral. Thousands of healthcare workers from dozens of countries responded with the same message. Same. The parallels weren't superficial. Modern healthcare workers during COVID experienced isolation eerily similar to medieval plague doctors. Many lived separately from their families for months, afraid of bringing infection home. They worked in protective equipment that dehumanized them visually. Patients couldn't see faces, only barriers. They dealt with mass death at a scale that overwhelmed normal coping mechanisms. They faced simultaneous gratitude and fear from communities that needed them, but were terrified of them. The psychological toll mirrors historical accounts. Modern research on healthcare worker mental health during COVID documented symptoms matching descriptions of plague: doctor, melancholy, emotional numbness, intrusive memories, difficulty sleeping, hypervigilance, moral injury from impossible triage decisions. A survey of ICU nurses found that 70% showed PTSD symptoms. Many described feeling detached from themselves while working, as if watching from outside their bodies. Plague doctors described the same dissociation centuries earlier, using different language but recognizing the same experience. The protective equipment creates similar psychological barriers. Modern PPE is designed to protect, but it also isolates. Healthcare workers reported that patients couldn't read their facial expressions, couldn't hear them clearly through masks, perceived them as frightening rather than comforting. The equipment was necessary, but created distance that made emotional connection difficult. Plague doctors faced the same problem. With their beaked masks, protection came at the cost of humanity. The barrier that kept them safe also prevented the human connection that makes medicine meaningful. Social stigma repeated historical patterns. Healthcare workers treating COVID patients faced discrimination, refused service in stores, asked to move out by landlords, avoided by neighbors. Essential workers one moment, contamination threats the next. Plague doctors experienced identical contradictions simultaneously, necessary and feared, honored and shunned. The same society that called them heroes also treated them as dangerous. Modern crisis medicine reproduces ethical dilemmas plague doctors faced. Triage during COVID meant deciding who received ventilators when demand exceeded supply. Healthcare workers made life and death decisions with inadequate information under impossible time pressure. Medieval plague doctors made similar choices about which houses to seal, which patients to treat, how to allocate limited resources. The circumstances differ, but the moral weight is comparable. Corruption risks emerge in both contexts. During COVID, shortages created black markets for protective equipment and medications. Some healthcare workers and administrators were caught hoarding supplies, price gouging, or prioritizing wealthy patients. These weren't systemic like plague doctor corruption, but they showed how crisis creates opportunities for exploitation, even in modern regulated systems. The impulse to profit from others' suffering isn't medieval, it's human, activated by circumstance. Healthcare workers during Ebola outbreaks faced even closer parallels. They worked in full-body protective suits that looked remarkably like modernized plague doctor costumes. They enforced quarantines, tracked contacts, supervised safe burials, exactly the functions plague doctors performed. They faced community resistance, conspiracy theories about deliberately spreading disease, and violence from people who didn't understand they were trying to help. Plague doctors dealt with identical suspicions. Modern epidemic response teams, specialized groups that deploy to outbreak zones, are direct descendants of plague doctors. They're trained specifically for infectious disease crisis response. They travel to wherever outbreaks occur. They operate under special authority granted during emergencies. They face elevated mortality risk compared to other medical professionals. The role has been professionalized, the training improved, the understanding corrected, but the fundamental function remains unchanged. What modern medicine learned from historical failures matters as much as continuities. We understand now that disease mechanisms must be understood, not just observed. Empirical effectiveness isn't enough. We need to know why interventions work so we can improve them. This knowledge came from recognizing that plague doctors' accidental successes were too unreliable to build medicine on. Modern systems emphasize oversight and accountability, even during crisis. Ethics committees review triage protocols. Regulatory agencies monitor for corruption. Professional organizations enforce standards. These structures exist partly because historical crises showed what happens without them, the exploitation and abuse that plagued plague doctors' work. Recognition that crisis workers need psychological support is another modern insight built on historical failure. Healthcare organizations now provide mental health resources, peer support, debriefing sessions. This came from understanding that trauma is inevitable in crisis medicine and must be addressed rather than ignored. Plague doctors got no such support and were destroyed by what they experienced. The technology improved, the knowledge advanced, the ethics strengthened, but the fundamental human challenges remain. Someone has to walk toward danger while others flee. Someone has to process death at industrial scale. Someone has to maintain functionality while witnessing horror. Someone has to balance competing duties to patients, to society, to themselves, to their families. A COVID healthcare worker wrote, "Every shift, I put on equipment that makes me look like a monster, so I can help people who are dying anyway. I go home to an empty apartment because I can't risk infecting my family. I try to sleep, but I see the faces. I wake up and do it again. How is this different from what plague doctors did? They had the beak. We have N95S, same job, same cost, same impossible choice between being who you are and doing what's necessary." The beaked mask became a symbol during COVID, appearing in protest art, social media memes, political commentary. People recognized the historical resonance. We were living through something plague doctors understood intimately. The specific disease was different. The medical knowledge was vastly better. But the existential experience of pandemic, the fear, the isolation, the mass death, the strain on systems designed for normalcy, that was the same. 6 centuries separate medieval plague doctors from modern pandemic healthcare workers. In that time, we've achieved extraordinary medical advances. We've decoded disease mechanisms, developed vaccines and antibiotics, built sophisticated public health systems. But we haven't eliminated the human cost of walking toward disease, while others can walk away. We haven't solved how to protect helpers without isolating them. We haven't found how to witness mass death without being changed by it. The echoes aren't coincidence. They're recognition that certain challenges are inherent to the work, not the era. Plague doctors weren't heroes or villains. They were people doing impossible work that damaged them in the doing. Modern healthcare workers during crises aren't different. They're the latest generation, wearing different masks, but carrying the same burdens, facing the same questions, paying the same costs. Understanding the plague doctor experience helps us understand our own. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And the rhyme of pandemic response, isolation, exhaustion, trauma, stigma, impossible choices, seems to be permanent. We can improve tools and knowledge. We apparently can't eliminate the fundamental human cost of standing between society and disease. Every generation believes it's learned from the past, that it's solved problems previous generations couldn't solve, that it's finally figured out how to handle crisis correctly. Plague doctors believed this. They thought they were more advanced than their predecessors, that their methods represented progress, that they finally understood disease. They were catastrophically wrong about almost everything. We think we're more advanced than plague doctors. We are, in specific technical ways. But history suggests we're equally wrong about something fundamental. The question is, what? Plague doctor history raises questions that every crisis resurrects. How much authority should society grant to emergency workers, and how do we prevent abuse while maintaining effectiveness? Plague doctors had enormous unchecked power. This enabled them to act quickly during catastrophe, but it also enabled corruption and cruelty. Modern systems attempt balance through oversight and accountability, but oversight slows response. During actual crisis, these structures often get suspended anyway, recreating the same authority without accountability problem plague doctors embodied. The question has no clean answer. Too much authority enables abuse. Too little makes effective response impossible. Every crisis forces society to choose how much control to surrender and to whom. And every crisis reveals that whatever balance we thought we'd achieved doesn't quite work when actually tested. When do individual rights become secondary to collective safety? Plague doctors sealed homes with healthy people inside to prevent disease spread. This violated every concept of individual freedom, but served collective protection. Modern democratic societies face identical tensions during pandemics, lockdowns, quarantines, mandatory vaccinations, contact tracing. We've refined the language and added due process, but the fundamental question remains: where's the line between individual liberty and public health? Different societies answer differently. Different individuals within societies disagree violently. The question is eternal because it pits two legitimate values against each other in ways that require choosing priorities rather than satisfying both. Plague doctors didn't solve this, they just enforced one side. We haven't solved it either, we just argue about it more formally. How do we maintain ethics when normal rules seem inadequate? Plague doctors operated in situations where standard medical ethics couldn't function. Informed consent, patients were dying and delirious. Careful evaluation, hundreds needed examination daily. Accountability, normal oversight had collapsed. So ethics degraded into expediency, and justification became, nothing normal applies here. Modern crisis medicine faces similar pressure. Triage protocols that would be unethical in normal times become necessary when resources can't serve everyone. Experimental treatments that would require extensive approval get deployed rapidly. Privacy protections that normally seem absolute get compromised for contact tracing. And always, the justification is identical. Extreme circumstances require extraordinary measures. But who decides when circumstances are extreme enough? And who ensures the extraordinary measures end when crisis passes? Plague doctors' emergency powers outlasted acute need because nobody wanted to surrender authority once granted. Modern surveillance and control measures implemented during COVID remained long after their necessity was debatable. The pattern repeats because crisis creates precedents that become permanent. Should dangerous essential work be financially incentivized? Plague doctors received high wages because the work was deadly. This attracted people willing to risk death for money, which included both altruists and opportunists. Modern hazard pay follows the same logic, but creates similar problems. Does paying premium wages for dangerous work honor sacrifice or create wrong incentives? Do we want people doing essential crisis work primarily because it pays well, or should motivation be service? There's no satisfying answer. Don't pay enough, and you can't recruit sufficient workers. Pay too much, and you attract people motivated by gain rather than care. Plague doctor history suggests both problems are unsolvable. You'll always have mixed motivations, and judging which motivations produce better outcomes is impossible because outcomes depend on countless variables. Why do some historical horrors get repeatedly memorialized while others fade? We remember plague doctors vividly. We barely remember other medieval medical practitioners who probably caused comparable suffering. The beaked mask became iconic, while other historical cruelties disappeared from cultural memory. This selective memorialization shapes how we understand the past and what lessons we think it teaches. Plague doctors get remembered partly because the imagery is striking, partly because plague itself was so devastating, partly because their role was distinctive enough to define them. But selective memory means selective learning. We think about lessons from plague doctors while ignoring lessons from forgotten historical figures who might teach us different things. Our fascination says more about us than about them. We're drawn to dramatic imagery and clear symbolism, rather than complex reality. What are we confident about today that future generations will recognize as catastrophically wrong? Plague doctors were certain about humoral theory, miasma, astrological influences on disease. They were experts. They had centuries of accumulated knowledge. They were fundamentally wrong about disease mechanisms. We're certain about things too, about how diseases work, how to respond to them, how to organize society during crisis. Some of this is surely correct. We have evidence and experimental verification plague doctors lacked. But some portion is probably wrong in ways we can't recognize, because our framework prevents us from seeing the errors. Future generations will look back at some of our certainties with the same mixture of pity and disbelief we feel looking at plague doctors. The questions have no final answers, because they're questions about competing values and unavoidable trade-offs. Every generation must grapple with them anew in different contexts, with different constraints. Plague doctors faced them with medieval tools and understanding. We face them with modern tools and understanding. Future generations will face them with whatever tools and understanding they develop. What remains constant is that crisis forces choices between inadequate options, between individual freedom and collective safety, between slow, careful ethics and fast, necessary action, between honoring sacrifice and preventing exploitation, between remembering trauma and moving beyond it. Plague doctors didn't solve these dilemmas, neither have we. The questions just keep recurring, wearing different masks, demanding different answers that are never quite right. Maybe that's the real lesson, not that we need better answers, but that we need humility about how difficult the questions are and how imperfect any answers must be. We're not more advanced than plague doctors in wisdom, only in knowledge. We know more about disease, We don't know more about being human under impossible pressure. And that's what crisis ultimately tests, not what we know, but who we are when knowing isn't enough. The statistics should have killed him. François de la Ferrière began working as a plague doctor in Paris in 1580. He was still working in 1603, 23 years, treating plague victims. He examined thousands of patients. He entered hundreds of plague houses. He handled contaminated materials daily. He should have died within months, like most of his colleagues did. Instead, he lived to age 91 and died in his sleep, from what records describe as natural causes related to age. No plague, no infection, no illness that could be connected to his decades of exposure. When other doctors asked about his survival, he claimed to have a secret, a method, a practice, something that protected him. He never wrote it down. 3 physicians who attempted to learn his technique all died of plague within a month of beginning their inquiries. Whether this was coincidence, whether François deliberately misled them, or whether something else was happening remains unclear. What's certain is that his survival was so improbable that it generated suspicion, envy, and theories that persisted long after his death. He wasn't unique. Records document other plague doctors whose survival defies statistical probability. A doctor in Marseille worked through 3 separate major outbreaks spanning 15 years. Each outbreak killed most of the city's medical practitioners within weeks. He examined patients throughout all 3 epidemics and never showed symptoms. Contemporary accounts mention him matter-of-factly. His survival was known but not understood, accepted as either divine favor or exceptional skill. Venice employed a plague doctor who claimed in correspondence to have examined over 2,000 plague patients across multiple outbreaks. City payment records confirm continuous employment spanning 12 years. He described his work in letters with clinical detachment, noting mortality rates, symptom patterns, and treatment outcomes. He never mentioned being ill. The letters simply stop in 1362 not because he died, but because he apparently retired and left the city. No death certificate exists in Venetian records. Modern science offers possible explanations. Some humans have genetic resistance to Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague. Variations in certain immune system genes make individuals less susceptible to infection, or better able to fight it off if infected. Prior exposure to related bacteria might have conferred partial immunity. These survivors might have been the lucky few whose biology protected them without their knowledge. Perhaps their protective practices were simply better. Some plague doctors were meticulous about their routines in ways others weren't. Records mention doctors who bathed in vinegar daily, who burned their clothing after each use rather than reusing it, who maintained strict physical distance from patients, even when examining them closely. These practices, while based on incorrect theory, might have reduced exposure enough to matter. Or maybe their accounts were exaggerated. Medieval record-keeping was imperfect. A plague doctor dying and being replaced by someone using the same professional name was documented practice in some cities. The plague doctor wasn't a specific person but a role, and the role continued regardless of individual mortality. What looks like one person surviving decades might actually be several people in succession, their individual identities lost to history while the professional identity persisted. But some cases resist easy explanation. Documented renewals of specific contracts with specific individuals, personal letters written in consistent handwriting across years, witnesses who knew the doctor personally and confirmed their continuous service. The evidence strongly suggests that certain individuals did survive improbable lengths of time doing work that killed most of their colleagues quickly. Survival seemed to correlate weakly with certain practices. Doctors who used vinegar extensively survived longer on average. This might be because acetic acid has mild antimicrobial properties, or might be coincidence. Doctors who avoided directly touching patients showed better survival. This makes sense, given what we now know about transmission. Doctors who maintained elaborate daily purification rituals had slightly better outcomes, possibly because ritual created consistency that reduced errors in protective practice. The anomalies frustrated contemporaries. Other plague doctors resented these survivors, suspecting they were avoiding actual work while collecting fees. Some cities investigated whether long-surviving doctors were really treating patients or just falsifying records. Most investigations found that the doctors were working legitimately, which made their survival even more puzzling. Suspicion sometimes went darker. A few long-surviving plague doctors were accused of witchcraft or having made pacts with supernatural forces. These accusations rarely led to prosecution. Cities needed plague doctors too badly to eliminate them over superstition. But the whispers persisted. How could someone walk through plague daily and never sicken unless something unnatural was protecting them? The truth is probably mundane. Genetic luck, rigorous protective practices, perhaps prior exposure that created immunity, possibly exaggerated accounts or confused identities. Nothing supernatural required. But the mundane explanation doesn't fully satisfy because the statistics are so extreme. When 95% of people doing a job die within months, the 5% who survive decades demand explanation beyond "they were careful." We'll never know François de la Ferrière's secret because he never revealed it. We'll never know if he actually had a secret or if survival was pure genetic fortune he attributed to skill. What remains is the mystery some people survived, what killed nearly everyone else. And we can't fully explain why. Their survival wasn't just statistically improbable. Sometimes it was impossibly strange. Florence, 1563. 5 plague doctors working in different districts reported the same dream on the same night. All 5 kept personal journals. All 5 noted it independently, describing identical imagery. They were treating patients whose faces were blank, no features, no expressions, just smooth skin where faces should be. The patients were screaming, but no sound came out. 2 days later, one of the 5 was found dead in a church. He was sitting in a pew, slumped forward. His plague doctor mask was on his face, but something was wrong. The mask had been attached. Not tied attached. Someone had used surgical needle and thread to sew the mask to his skin, creating a permanent fusion between leather and flesh. The stitching was precise, professional, the work of someone with medical knowledge. Contemporary accounts couldn't determine if this was done to him or if he'd done it to himself. No signs of struggle, no defensive wounds. The church had been locked from inside. No one else was present. His hands showed dried blood matching his facial wounds, suggesting he'd held the needle himself. But the stitching on the back of his head would have been impossible to do without help. The other 4 plague doctors who'd shared the dream refused to discuss it. 3 left Florence within the week. The 4th continued working but stopped keeping a journal. City records note his death 3 months later, from plague, ordinary plague, nothing unusual. The investigation ended there. The incident was filed as probable suicide under severe melancholy, which might be accurate but doesn't explain the shared dream or the impossible stitching pattern. Venice, 1576. A plague doctor was found floating in a canal. Drowning was common enough. Venice was surrounded by water, and people fell in regularly. But the body showed no water in the lungs. The autopsy, performed by another plague doctor, found cause of death indeterminable. The victim hadn't drowned. He showed no injuries, no signs of poisoning, no symptoms of plague or any disease. He was simply dead, found in water he hadn't drowned in, dead from nothing anyone could identify. His costume was still on when they found him. The beak, the coat, the gloves, full protective equipment. The costume would have made swimming impossible. If he'd fallen accidentally, he would have drowned immediately from the weight. If he'd intended to drown himself, why wear the costume? If someone killed him and threw him in, why no signs of violence? The questions accumulated without answers. Eventually, the case was closed as accidental death, which satisfied no one but allowed the paperwork to be completed. Avignon, 1348. 3 plague doctors were found unconscious in a plague house they'd been examining. City authorities, worried they'd contracted plague, isolated them for observation. But they showed no plague symptoms. They woke after several hours, confused, with no memory of what happened. They'd entered the house together to examine a family. Their last memory was approaching the front room. Then nothing until waking up under observation. All 3 had identical burns on their right palms. Perfect circles, about an inch across, like they'd grabbed something extremely hot. But nothing in the plague house was hot. No candles were burning. No fires were lit. No objects showed signs of having been heated. And why would all three grab the same hot object in the same way? The burns were documented by the physician who examined them, described as unusual but not severe. The three recovered physically, but could never explain what happened. One later claimed he'd been having dreams about the incident, dreams that showed them doing something in that house, something he couldn't quite remember when awake. Group phenomena appear in other records. Multiple plague doctors in different cities reported seeing the same figure during outbreaks. A tall man in dark clothing who appeared at death scenes, always at the edge of vision, gone when looked at directly. This sounds like collective hallucination driven by stress and fear, which is probably correct. Mercury poisoning from their treatments could cause hallucinations. Extreme exhaustion creates perceptual distortions. The human mind under pressure sees patterns that aren't there. But some cases resist easy psychological explanation. In 1665 London, two plague doctors working in separate districts, who'd never met, both described finding the same symbol marked in chalk on plague house doors. A symbol not part of any official marking system, not from any known alphabet or notation. Both copied it into their journals. The symbols match exactly. Neither knew what it meant. Modern historians examining those journals can't identify the symbol either. Unusual deaths plague doctors who simply stopped living with no discernible cause. Disappearances where thorough searches found nothing. Incidents of plague doctors found in locations they couldn't have reached. Locked buildings they had no keys to. Sealed plague houses they'd supposedly certified days earlier. Each case has possible mundane explanations. Forgotten keys, errors in records, hidden medical conditions that killed suddenly. But the accumulation of strange incidents creates a pattern that feels like more than coincidence. Mercury poisoning is probably responsible for many bizarre events. The treatments plague doctors administered were loaded with mercury compounds. Chronic exposure causes neurological damage, hallucinations, tremors, personality changes, and death. Some mysterious deaths were probably just mercury poisoning, killing in ways medieval autopsies couldn't detect. Some shared experiences were probably shared poisoning symptoms interpreted through cultural expectations of supernatural forces. Psychological breakdown explains others. Extreme sustained stress creates dissociative episodes, false memories, perceptual distortions. Plague doctors lived in constant trauma. Their minds would have protected them through mechanisms that sometimes manifested as strange experiences or behaviors. The unexplained incidents might be symptoms of collective psychological collapse, rather than genuine mysteries. But not everything fits neatly into those explanations. Some cases are too specific, too well documented, too bizarre to dismiss as simply stress or poison. History contains genuine mysteries, events documented by multiple reliable witnesses that nonetheless make no sense with our current understanding. Plague doctors operated in extreme conditions that might have pushed them into experiences we can't fully reconstruct from documentary evidence alone. We can't prove supernatural intervention, we don't need to. But we can acknowledge that some incidents remain unexplained, despite reasonable attempts at explanation. History isn't always solvable. Sometimes the honest answer is, we don't know. Something happened. We have records. We can't explain them. And maybe that's the most intellectually honest place to stop. Edinburgh, 1890. Workers renovating an old building found a journal sealed inside a wall cavity. The journal was dated 1645, written by a plague doctor during one of Scotland's recurring plague outbreaks. Most of it was routine medical notes. But sections were written in code, not a standard cipher, but something unique to this writer. Cryptographers spent 80 years trying to decode it. They succeeded partially. Most of the coded sections dealt with treatments he was testing, observations about what seemed to help, notes about survival rates. But one passage, translated and retranslated, consistently reads approximately, "The cure is simple, and has always been simple. They will kill me if I write it plainly." But the truth is, in the garden. No one knows what it means. The garden could be literal herbal remedies from medicinal gardens. It could be metaphorical. Something from nature, something obvious that people overlook. It could be nonsense written by a traumatized man who thought he'd discovered something profound but had actually just lost coherence. We don't know. We'll probably never know. But the phrase tantalizingly suggests that some plague doctors believed they'd found genuine insights they couldn't safely share. References to hidden knowledge appear scattered through plague doctor records. Letters mention methods that cannot be written. Wills demand that personal papers be destroyed rather than archived. Coded correspondence between plague doctors hints at shared information not meant for authorities or the public. Why hide knowledge during a catastrophe when sharing it could save lives? Several possible reasons, none entirely satisfying. Professional jealousy could explain it. A plague doctor who developed an effective treatment might keep it secret to maintain competitive advantage, ensuring continued employment and high wages. This seems darkly plausible. Humans protect valuable information even when sharing would benefit others. But it seems unlikely to be universal. Some plague doctors would have shared out of compassion or duty. Fear of persecution could explain other cases. If a treatment worked but seemed heretical, using forbidden substances, practices that resembled witchcraft, methods that contradicted church teachings, a plague doctor might hide it to avoid accusations. Testing on patients without explicit permission, experimenting with procedures that violated contemporary ethics, discovering something through means that couldn't be admitted, all could motivate secrecy. A manuscript fragment from the 16th century describes preparing a treatment using mold from specific types of bread. The description sounds remarkably similar to principles behind penicillin, using naturally occurring mold to fight infection. Did some plague doctor stumble onto antibiotic principles centuries before Fleming? The fragment exists. Whether it represents genuine discovery, coincidental similarity, or later embellishment is impossible to determine. Accounts exist of plague doctors achieving unusually high patient survival rates. Rates that statistical analysis suggests couldn't be luck alone. A doctor in Marseille noted survival rates double the city average. His methods weren't documented in detail, but references suggest unusual hygiene practices and dietary recommendations for patients. When he died, his papers were reportedly destroyed per his instructions. Coincidence? Tragedy? Deliberate suppression of knowledge? We can't know. Modern researchers have attempted to reconstruct possible lost knowledge. Chemical analysis of surviving medical supplies from plague eras revealed unexpected compounds, combinations of substances that shouldn't appear together unless someone was deliberately experimenting. Analysis of plague doctor writings using modern forensic techniques revealed invisible writing on some documents, notes written in lemon juice or other substances that only appear under certain lighting. Most of this hidden writing deals with personal matters, but some discusses medical observations the writer apparently didn't want openly documented. The network of plague doctors discussed earlier might have shared information they kept from authorities. Evidence suggests knowledge exchange between plague doctors across cities, but the content of what they shared is largely lost. Were they protecting effective practices from official interference? Sharing useless methods they mistakenly believed worked? Coordinating exploitation schemes? All three simultaneously? Healthy skepticism is necessary. Most secrets were probably worthless. Plague doctors operated from wrong theories and likely believed ineffective methods were revolutionary. Their secrecy might protect nothing more valuable than superstition they feared admitting to. The dramatic idea of suppressed effective treatments is compelling, but probably mostly fantasy. Yet, medical history contains genuine examples of discoveries made and lost, methods that worked before anyone understood why, knowledge that disappeared and had to be rediscovered centuries later. Ancient Romans had concrete formulas that were lost for 1,000 years. Greek fire's composition remains unknown. Numerous herbal remedies dismissed as folk medicine turned out to contain active compounds when analyzed scientifically. Lost knowledge is real. The question is whether plague doctors possessed any worth losing. What would constitute proof? Documentation of a treatment that, when analyzed with modern understanding, shows genuine efficacy beyond placebo. Records of survival rates so anomalous, they require explanation beyond chance. Recovery of hidden documents that describe methods matching what we now know works. We don't have these. We have fragments, hints, suggestions. Enough to intrigue, but not enough to conclude. The intellectually honest position is uncertainty. Some plague doctors might have stumbled onto insights ahead of their time. Some might have hidden knowledge for legitimate or selfish reasons. Most secrets were probably worthless, but statistical likelihood suggests not all were. History is vast, documentation is incomplete, and human discovery is often accidental. Could a plague doctor have found something genuine? Possibly. Can we prove it? Not with available evidence. The garden might have held truth, or might have held nothing. The coded journals might protect profound insights, or mundane observations. The destroyed papers might have contained medical breakthroughs or meaningless ramblings. We're left with mysteries that might be meaningful, or might just be the noise of incomplete history, interpreted hopefully. What remains is the question itself, haunting, unresolved, probably unresolvable. Did they know something we don't? The answer is locked in ashes, hidden in codes, buried in gardens that bloomed centuries ago and died without telling their secrets. Every generation rediscovers plague doctors and thinks they've found something new. The image resurfaces in different contexts, as protest art during pandemics, as video game characters, as Halloween costumes, as historical curiosity. Each generation believes it's the first to truly see them, to understand what they represent. But plague doctors were never lost. They've been waiting in the shadows of history, their beaked masks turning toward each new pandemic, each new crisis, as if to say, "We told you. You weren't ready then. You're still not ready now." Why can't we forget them? Why does this image persist when thousands of other historical figures fade into obscurity? The answer has layers, each revealing something about what plague doctors mean to us beyond their actual historical function. First, they represent humanity's confrontation with its deepest fear, mass death, from invisible, unstoppable forces. Plague doctors stood at the boundary between the living and the dead, trying to hold back catastrophe with inadequate tools and wrong understanding. That attempt matters more than whether it succeeded. They show us humans refusing to surrender, even when surrender seems rational. Every generation faces similar fears, different diseases, different catastrophes, but the same existential dread. Plague doctors remind us that previous generations faced it too, and somehow continued. Second, they embody complexity that simple heroes and villains never achieve. They were simultaneously essential and dangerous, compassionate and corrupt, victims and perpetrators. They saved some people and killed others. They acted from courage and from greed. They demonstrated the best and worst of human nature, often in the same person, sometimes in the same action. This complexity makes them psychologically real in ways that simplified historical figures aren't. We can't reduce them to a moral lesson because they refuse to fit into moral categories cleanly. Third, they humble us. Here were people who believed they understood disease, who had centuries of accumulated medical knowledge, who were experts by contemporary standards. They were catastrophically wrong about almost everything. Their certainty was matched only by their ignorance. This should terrify us because we're in the same position with our own certainties. We believe we understand things plague doctors didn't. But what are we equally wrong about, while being equally confident? Plague doctors remind us that expertise and understanding aren't the same thing, that consensus can be utterly mistaken, that future generations will look at some of our practices with the same horror we feel, looking at bloodletting and toxic poultices. What makes plague doctors different from other historical medical figures is that they occupied a unique space crisis, created them, necessity sustained them, and desperation gave them power that normal times would never grant. They weren't part of established medical tradition, evolving slowly. They were improvisations that became institutions, desperate solutions that persisted long enough to develop their own culture and methods. They show us how crisis reshapes society in ways that outlast the crisis itself. They've become symbols for multiple concepts, flexible enough to represent different things to different people. Sometimes their medical futility, the image of doctors who couldn't cure, who tried everything and accomplished nothing. Sometimes they're courage people who walked toward death when everyone else fled. Sometimes they're corruption healers who became predators, using crisis for personal gain. Sometimes they're transformation, the costume as metaphor for how crisis changes us, how we put on masks and become something other than ourselves to survive. The 21st century can't forget them, because recent experience made them relevant again. COVID-19 brought plague doctor imagery flooding back, not as historical curiosity, but as direct parallel. Healthcare workers saw themselves in centuries-old figures. The beaked mask became protest symbol, meme, shorthand for pandemic anxiety. The image wasn't resurrected, it was always there, waiting for circumstances that would make it meaningful again. Our cultural fascination with dark aesthetics elevates their visual impact. The plague doctor costume is striking, unsettling, instantly recognizable. It works in any artistic medium, carries immediate emotional weight, and communicates without explanation. Modern culture loves this imagery that's historically grounded, but aesthetically powerful, real but also somehow mythological. We've turned plague doctors into icons that transcend their historical reality. Our questioning of medical and governmental authority echoes medieval ambivalence. Just as medieval people simultaneously needed and feared plague doctors, we simultaneously depend on and distrust institutional authority during crisis. The parallel isn't exact, but the psychological dynamic is similar. Plague doctors remind us that this tension isn't new, that every generation struggles with how much power to grant authorities and how to prevent abuse of that power. They appear everywhere in modern media. Video games use them as character designs representing plague zones or dark medicine. Horror films employ them for instant atmospheric dread. Art installations use the costume to comment on pandemic response, medical authority, or death itself. The image has become separated from its historical context, transformed into pure symbol that carries meaning even for people who know nothing about actual plague doctor history. What does it mean that we've turned real suffering into aesthetic fascination? That plague doctor masks are sold as decorative items, that the costume is worn casually, that genuine historical horror has become entertainment? This could be disrespectful, trivializing tragedy, turning death into commodity. Or it could be how cultures process trauma by transforming what terrorized us into something we control, making the nightmare familiar enough to be bearable. Or it could simply be human nature to be drawn to darkness, to find beauty in horror, to be fascinated by what frightens us. Remembering plague doctors serves practical purposes beyond fascination. They provide historical context for pandemic response, showing us what's changed and what hasn't. They offer lessons about crisis management, the dangers of unchecked authority, the importance of oversight, the psychological costs of essential work. They remind us that people doing necessary but traumatic work need support rather than just gratitude. They demonstrate that crisis reveals existing problems rather than creating new ones. The corruption, the exploitation, the ethical failures were always possible. Crisis just made them visible. But maybe the deepest reason we can't forget them is simpler. They were people, ordinary people thrust into impossible circumstances, who responded with the full complexity humans bring to everything. They weren't mythological figures. They were someone's father, someone's friend, someone who woke up one day and decided, or was forced to put on a mask and walk toward what others fled. They made choices we might face. They asked questions we still ask. They struggled with dilemmas we haven't solved. By remembering them, we honor that struggle. Not because they succeeded, they mostly didn't. Not because they were heroes, many weren't. But because they were human in ways that remain recognizable across centuries. They were afraid and did it anyway. They were traumatized and kept working. They witnessed the worst of humanity and sometimes still managed compassion. They made terrible mistakes while trying to help. That complexity is worth remembering because it's honest. History filled only with heroes or only with villains is comfortable but false. History that shows people as complicated, flawed, occasionally noble, frequently failing. That's uncomfortable but true. Plague doctors give us uncomfortable truth. And maybe we keep returning to them because, on some level, we know we need that truth more than we need comfortable myths. The beaked mask endures because what it represents never stopped being relevant. 6 centuries separate us from the first plague doctors, but not 6 centuries of different challenges. Just 6 centuries of similar challenges wearing different forms. The mask is still being worn. We've just redesigned it for modern materials and modern understanding. But someone is still putting it on, still walking toward what others avoid. still paying the cost of standing between society and catastrophe. We can't forget plague doctors because forgetting them would mean forgetting ourselves. When faced with impossible circumstances, what would you do? This isn't rhetorical. It's not hypothetical. It's the question plague doctors force us to confront, and it remains as urgent now as it was in 1347. Would you put on the mask and face the dying, knowing you'd probably die too? Would you flee like the university physicians who valued their lives over their oaths? Would you try to help even knowing your help was probably worthless? Would you use the chaos to advance yourself at others' expense? You don't know. Neither do I. Neither did they, until circumstances demanded an answer. What plague doctors teach about human nature is that we contain multitudes, courage and cowardice, compassion and cruelty, selflessness and exploitation, nobility and corruption. We carry all of these possibilities simultaneously, and circumstances determine which emerge. The people who became plague doctors weren't fundamentally different from those who became refugees, or looters, or survivors, or victims. They were ordinary humans who found themselves in extraordinary situations and responded according to some combination of character, opportunity, and accident. This should be humbling rather than comforting. We like to believe we know who we are, that our values are fixed, that we'd act heroically in crisis. Plague doctor history suggests this confidence is misplaced. People surprised themselves, the coward who stayed, the hero who fled, the doctor who started compassionate and ended corrupt, the criminal who found redemption through service. Crisis revealed aspects of people they didn't know existed. Sometimes those revelations were beautiful. Often they were terrible. Always they were more complex than anyone expected. The choices plague doctors faced weren't between good and evil, but between inadequate options with unclear consequences. Stay and probably die, but possibly help. Flee and definitely survive, but definitely fail your duty. Try experimental treatments that might work or might cause additional suffering. Enforce quarantines that protect communities, but devastate families. Accept bribes that feed your family, but exploit others' desperation. Every choice carried costs, and often the costs were impossible to calculate in advance. We face similar dilemmas constantly, though usually at lower stakes. How much of ourselves do we sacrifice for others? When does self-preservation become selfishness? When does helping become enabling? When does authority become tyranny? These questions don't have final answers because they depend on context, on specifics, on judgment calls that might be right or wrong, and often we'll never know which. Circle back to the human beings behind the masks. Someone woke up on their first day as a plague doctor, put on the costume for the first time, and walked toward their first dying patient. What did that feel like? The weight of the coat, the restriction of the mask, the fear that no amount of aromatics could filter away. They approached the door knowing that behind it was suffering they couldn't prevent, and death they couldn't stop. They knocked anyway. That moment between knocking and the door opening, what went through their mind? Someone returned home after a day of death. 50 houses visited, 40 deaths certified, 10 families sealed inside with plague. They removed the costume piece by piece, trying to leave the day's horror with it. They sat alone with vinegar-burned skin and memories that wouldn't fade. They tried to eat, but nothing tasted right. They tried to sleep, but nightmares waited. And tomorrow they'd wake and do it again. How many days until they stopped feeling human? How many deaths until numbers replaced names? At what point did the mask become more real than the face underneath? Someone woke each morning knowing it might be their last. The statistics were clear, most plague doctors died quickly. Each morning brought a choice to continue or quit, and continuing meant accepting probable death before the week ended. Why continue? Some for money, some for duty. Some because continuing felt easier than confronting what quitting meant about themselves. Some because they'd lost everything else, and this gave purpose to survival. Plague doctors weren't so different from us. They weren't medieval aliens with fundamentally foreign psychology. They were people. They had fears we recognize, hopes we share, weaknesses we possess. They wanted to live, wanted to matter, wanted to believe their suffering had meaning. They made mistakes. They occasionally did better than they had to. They were complicated in exactly the ways humans are always complicated. The distance we feel from them is partly comfort and partly illusion. We tell ourselves we'd act differently, better, more nobly. Maybe we would. Probably we wouldn't. Most likely, we'd act exactly as complicated and flawed as they did. Sometimes rising to circumstances, sometimes failing utterly, usually muddling through while trying to live with the choices we made or that circumstances made for us. By remembering plague doctors, we honor complexity. Not their successes, most of those were accidental. Not their failures, most of those were inevitable. But their humanity, which was neither success nor failure but simply the condition of being human under impossible pressure. They tried. Sometimes trying looked like heroism. Sometimes it looked like corruption. Usually, it looked like exhausted people doing what they thought was necessary and hoping it was enough. History connects us to them, not because we're the same technology, knowledge, and circumstances differ enormously, but because the fundamental questions remain unchanged. How do we act when normal rules collapse? What do we owe each other during catastrophe? How do we maintain ethics when circumstances seem to suspend them? Who are we when everything comfortable is stripped away? These aren't historical questions. They're human questions. Plague doctors ask them. We ask them. Future generations will ask them. The legacy isn't the beaked mask, though that's what we remember. The legacy is the question itself. In crisis, who will you be? The answer matters less than the honesty of confronting that you don't know. That knowing requires being tested in ways you hope you never are, and that everyone who came before you faced the same uncertainty and discovered themselves only through experience. Somewhere in a museum archive, there's a plague doctor's mask that no one has worn for 300 years. Sometimes late at night, security guards report they can smell flowers and spices, lavender, rose, myrrh coming from its case. They say it's just old preservation chemicals. But every guard who smelled it says the same thing. It doesn't smell like death. It smells like someone still trying to help, still trying to heal, still refusing to give up. Maybe that's the real legacy. Not the failures, not the horrors, but the fact that they tried. That when faced with impossible circumstances and inadequate tools and wrong understanding and almost certain death, some people still chose to try. Not all of them. Not even most of them. But enough that the choice remains meaningful. The question they leave behind isn't what they did. It's what you'll do when your turn comes. You chose to spend hours learning about death, disease, and people who walked through hell wearing bird masks. That choice says something about you. Maybe you're curious about how humans behave when everything breaks. Maybe you're trying to understand your own fears by examining someone else's nightmare. Or maybe you just needed company in the dark hours. Whatever brought you here, you stayed. And that matters more than you might think. Engaging with dark history reveals things about us. We're drawn to understanding mortality, not in abstract philosophical terms, but in concrete historical detail. What did it feel like to face plague daily? How did people cope with constant death? What happened to those who witnessed the worst humanity can experience? These questions fascinate us because they're ultimately about ourselves. We want to know how we'd handle similar circumstances, even though we hope never to find out. The act of learning about plague doctors demonstrates something valuable: curiosity and willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Many people would rather not think about pandemics, medical failure, corruption during crisis, or the psychological costs of essential work. You chose to think about all of it. That choice suggests you're someone who wants to understand reality rather than retreat into comfortable ignorance. That's not a small thing. What can you carry forward from this journey? Several lessons embedded in plague doctor history transcend their specific circumstances. Crisis reveals character rather than creates it. Plague doctors weren't transformed by plague into new people. They became more fully whatever they already were. The compassionate became more compassionate. The selfish became more corrupt. The fearful fled. The curious stayed. You are, right now, whoever you'll be during crisis. The circumstances will just make it more visible. Knowing this, you can work on who you are before testing arrives. Authority without accountability breeds corruption regardless of good intentions. Plague doctors had power and minimal oversight, and many abused it. Modern systems attempt accountability, but crisis often suspends it out of necessity. Understanding this pattern helps you recognize when emergency powers are justified and when they're being exploited. Vigilance about authority doesn't mean rejecting it. It means ensuring it serves rather than dominates. Ignorance combined with confidence is more dangerous than admitted uncertainty. Plague doctors were certain about humoral theory, miasma, astrological influences. Their certainty killed people. When we're certain about things we don't actually understand, we cause harm while believing we're helping. Better to admit uncertainty and proceed carefully than to proceed confidently in the wrong direction. This applies to medicine, politics, personal decisions, everything. Small acts of compassion matter even in overwhelming darkness. The plague doctor who held a dying child's hand changed nothing medically, but changed everything emotionally. Grand heroic gestures are rare. Small moments of human connection during crisis are what people remember, what sustains them, what makes horror bearable. You can't solve catastrophe, but you can make individual moments less terrible. That's not nothing. Support those who do essential but traumatic work. Plague doctors needed psychological support they never received, and many were destroyed by their experiences. Modern crisis workers need more than gratitude. They need actual systems that recognize and address the mental health costs of their work. This applies to healthcare workers, emergency responders, anyone whose job requires regular exposure to trauma. They're paying costs most people don't see. Acknowledging and supporting that matters. Preparation before crisis beats improvisation during crisis. Plague doctors were improvisation desperate solutions created after catastrophe arrived. They were better than nothing, but worse than what preparedness might have created. Thinking about crisis response before crisis arrives saves lives. This applies personally, professionally, and societally. What will you do if isn't paranoia, it's wisdom. Today's certainties might be tomorrow's superstitions. Future generations will look at some of our current practices and be horrified. We can't know which ones, but historical humility suggests caution about assuming we've figured everything out. Medicine, politics, ethics, technology, in all domains, some of what we believe is probably wrong. Maintaining intellectual humility helps us correct course when evidence suggests we're mistaken. Let's address the elephant in the room. You sought this content for sleep, for relaxation, for late-night companionship. There's nothing wrong with that. Disturbing historical content can be oddly comforting. It provides perspective. Whatever challenges you face probably aren't as severe as plague. It reminds you that humans survived worse. It offers the safety of examining horror from a distance where it can't hurt you. The content serves multiple purposes simultaneously: educational, comforting, challenging, contemplative. You can find plague doctors fascinating and disturbing, and sad, and even aesthetically compelling. Humans are complex. Your reactions don't have to be simple. By choosing to learn about plague doctors rather than ignore them, you demonstrated something essential for navigating uncertain times. You're willing to look at difficulty directly. You don't need reality sanitized or simplified. You can handle complexity, moral ambiguity, uncomfortable questions without easy answers. These are strengths that serve you well when circumstances become challenging. Acknowledge the privilege of learning about pandemics as history rather than living through them. Most humans who encountered plague doctors did so while dying or watching loved ones die. You're engaging with the story from safety, with medical knowledge and infrastructure they couldn't imagine. This privilege can disappear faster than we expect. Appreciating it, while maintaining awareness of its fragility, creates appropriate balance between complacency and anxiety. Remember, plague doctors not by romanticizing or demonizing them, but by understanding them. They were people in impossible circumstances who responded with human complexity. They succeeded accidentally and failed inevitably. They harmed and helped, sometimes simultaneously. They were changed by their experiences in ways that couldn't be undone. They paid costs that went unrecognized. And somehow, despite everything, some maintained enough humanity to make small differences that mattered to specific individuals, even when they couldn't change the larger outcome. That's what you carry forward, understanding that crisis reveals us, that authority requires accountability, that certainty masks ignorance, that small kindness matters. that support for crisis workers is essential, that preparation beats improvisation, and that humility serves us better than confidence. And maybe one more thing, the recognition that 6 centuries from now, someone might be learning about us with the same mixture of fascination and horror we feel learning about plague doctors. What will they think about how we handled our crises, our failures, our ethical compromises? We can't know. But understanding that future judgment is coming might make us more thoughtful about the choices we make now. The documentary is ending. The story of plague doctors continues, as it always does, waiting in historical shadows for the next generation to rediscover them and believe they're seeing them for the first time. But you've truly seen them now, not as simple symbols, but as complicated humans, whose story reveals uncomfortable truths about crisis, authority, suffering, and survival. You've traveled through 6 centuries, walked beside figures wearing beaked masks through streets where death was ordinary, witnessed their courage and their cruelty, their success and their failure, their humanity and the cost of maintaining it. You know them now in ways most people never will. As you drift towards sleep, carry this with you. History connects us across impossible distances to people who faced questions we still face. Their answers weren't always good, but their questions were always honest. The beak doesn't just look backward at medieval nightmares. It looks forward, asking whether we've learned anything, whether we're ready, whether we'll do better when our turn comes. The answer waits in the future. But the question lives with us now, passed down from every generation that faced catastrophe and tried to respond with whatever tools and wisdom they possessed. You've heard their story. You understand their question. And somewhere in the darkness, the beak nods in acknowledgement you're ready for whatever comes next, or at least as ready as anyone ever is. Sleep well. The shadows of history are watching, but they're not threatening. They're just remembering, and hoping we remember too.